A rustling sound came from the depths of the garbage pit beneath the city walls. The piles of junk began to move, and a hand suddenly burst out from underneath them. The boy, covered in dirt and sweat, slowly rose to his feet. His name was Vlad. He had survived, which meant it was not time to give up. Vlad stood in front of the old forge, his gaze fixed on the sword hanging on the wall. Damn, it was so cool. A familiar voice came from behind him. Ximena crossed her arms, studying him closely. I knew you would come. You gave up on this. I was just taking a break, he chuckled. Her voice grew quieter. A break, huh? Do you know what rumors there are about you? Do you still hear voices when you pick up a stick? Vlad looked away but said nothing. And what did you do in your past life that you were struck by black lightning in broad daylight? Ximena chuckled. The new bishop isn't joking. He was an inquisitor. If he suspects something is wrong, he'll send you to the stake. Vlad winced. Why are you telling me this? I'm just worried about you, idiot. Everyone saw you get struck by lightning. People are whispering. But he wasn't listening. His gaze was riveted on his sword again. If the church takes you, it's not my fault, Ximena snorted. They won't put me in jail for just looking, he smirked. So buy it already, 5 gold coins. Ximena froze. 5? That's a fortune. A piece of metal? The blacksmith flew out of the forge with a crash. Stupid kids, get out of here! Ximena snorted and Vlad calmly turned around. Okay, we're leaving. The blacksmith watched them go, muttering something about stubborn brats. Then his gaze fell on the sword. He stood in this place for a long time, as if waiting for someone to come for him. This city is the center of the northern economy, the beacon of the northern region, personifying the strength of the Bayazid family, Sora. It is only natural that in such a bright place there are also dark shadows, the slums where the dirtiest things happen. Meanwhile, Vlad came to his work in a cath house called Smile Roses. There was a lively atmosphere inside. Men were having fun with girls and sipping alcohol. Suddenly, a loud scream of a girl was heard on the second floor, and everyone's eyes immediately looked up. The man pulled her by the hair and showered her with all sorts of insults, shouting, she dared to deceive him? In response, she exclaimed, how could she deceive him? He said with displeasure that he had been working as a mercenary for 20 years. How dare she slip him a fake? Vlad, who was just on the second floor, came up to them holding a box of candles in his hands and said that it was always so noisy here. The man called him a candle maker and, pointing his finger at him, said that he was just in time. Let him bring madam. He replied that in order to meet their madam, he needed to pay in gold, not silver. The mercenary got angry and exclaimed, what gold are we talking about? If there is no madam, let him bring his mother. These words made the protagonist angry and frowned. Without waiting for an answer from him, the man exclaimed, candles that measure time, that's a scam, right? Why do they burn out when he hasn't had time to do anything yet? Vlad sighed tiredly and asked how he could possibly do anything in 5 minutes. Let him go to his wife if he had no money. The mercenary gritted his teeth in rage and asked what he said. The protagonist made a disgusted face and said that he was making too much noise. Maybe they should check it. He took a candle and pointed it at the clock, asking if he could see what time it was. They would see if the candle burned for 5 minutes or not. If not, then he could do whatever he wanted with this woman. The mercenary asked why he should listen to a swindler. In response, Vlad looked at him with a hard and threatening look, saying that he said so, they would just check. But if the candle burned for 5 minutes, then he would beat the crap out of him. Hearing this, the man shuddered in fear, and then looked into the candlemaker's eyes, as if they were burning a hole, and thought, what's wrong with him? After that, Vlad struck a match on the railing and sat down, asking who is the swindler now. He lit a candle, and the man became very nervous, after which the protagonist stood up and began to wait. The girl, who was still being held by the hair, began to calm down slowly. It seemed that the entire cath house froze in anticipation of whether it would burn down now in the allotted time or earlier. The protagonist lowered his piercing gaze downwards, after which the candle burned out, and the man let out an astonished sigh. Having become nervous, he immediately turned to the clock and cursed in his mind, thinking, from what time did they count? Vlad called out to him, and then immediately hit him in the face with a stick, from which he screamed loudly and lost his balance, falling to the floor. He called him an idiot and said that there were 5 minutes, after which he turned around and bent one leg, then sharply straightened it and hit the mercenary on the back. He flew back into the room and hit the floor, and Vlad came in after him and closed the door. Covering his face, the man looked at the candlemaker, and he said that he was finished. He stretched one hand forward in fear and asked him to wait, but Vlad threw him to the floor again and started beating him with a stick, saying that he wanted to deceive them. What kind of mercenary is he with a belly like that? And what did he want there? Bring his mother? He should be more tactful with people without moms. Loud screams of a man were heard in the room, which could be heard even from outside, and Vlad told him to shut up. Soon morning came, and the workers gathered for breakfast. The protagonist said that it seemed that someone had damaged the candles. There had not been 5 minutes there. He did understand what he said, right? He called out to Jorge and repeated that someone had damaged the candles. But the former knight was not interested. He cut off a piece of sausage and threw it into his mouth, briefly agreeing. Madame Marcella exclaimed, "Who dared to do this? Who dared to spoil their precious candles?" Vlad turned his gaze to her and replied that they needed to find out. She agreed with him and crossed her arms over her chest in displeasure, telling him to find the culprit. He pointed his finger at himself and asked how he could find the criminal. She exclaimed in response that she had already found it. Hearing this, he was very surprised and asked who it was. She smiled and said that it was her. She was just joking a little. She wanted to deceive those drunks and get more money. She was all sparkling with joy, and he remained silent. After breakfast, he went down to the first floor and sighed heavily, wondering, so he beat up that man for nothing? He sighed and decided not to dwell on it, saying that he was just a worker. On the floor below, he met a familiar group of men. One of them, named Burley, called out to him and said that he was proud of him. He heard about yesterday. He did well. Had anything happened while he was gone? He threw his arm over his shoulder and asked. He learned a few secrets about selling candles yesterday, right? They needed money. They were broke at the moment. Vlad looked up at him with displeasure and asked what he wanted from him. Seeing his frightening eyes, Burley immediately jumped back and raised his hands, telling him not to be so scared. He was not asking him to give them to him. It would be a good deal. He repeated warily, "A deal?" Burley smiled and said that he would give him something, and he would give it to him. After that, they went down to the cellar, and he, showing him a beaten child named Ned, whom he was holding by the hair, said that he was a pickpocket, clumsy, stupid, and inept. He recognized him, didn't he? He will return it for 40 silver. It is a good deal. The muscles on the protagonist's face tensed with anger, and he asked what happened to his fingers and toes. Burley replied that if they were cut off, he would not have called him. He just taught him a lesson. He is completely intact. Vlad clenched his teeth and closed his eyes, thinking about something, and then threw a bag of jingling coins on the floor, and Burley happily said that he knew he could rely on him. Vlad replied that next time, he should just kill him, and not look for him. Burley, along with his guys, headed for the stairs and waved his hand, telling him not to say that. They are bandits, not murderers. The protagonist answered discontentedly that they are deceiving a colleague of his own family. Burley asked one of his guys, he saw it, right? He said that he would agree. After all, he's responsible for stray children. Vlad, meanwhile, looked down sternly at Ned and called out to him, and he winced and apologized to him, saying that he tried to be careful. He was silent for a few seconds, examining him, and then asked, "Were the bones broken?" The boy rubbed his neck and answered that they were not, after which Vlad closed his eyes, holding back his rage, and pointed his finger at the stairs, telling him to get lost now, before he himself broke his bones. Ned quickly got up and went to the exit of the cellar, thanking him. The protagonist meanwhile sighed in disappointment and rubbed his neck, saying that here are his 5 gold coins. After that, he went to the port to see his friend. Harvin, a whale hunter who served Captain Hoover, wrote something in a notebook and, after listening to the story, said that this boy was lucky. He showed his hand on which 2 fingers were missing and said that at least he did not lose his fingers. He himself had his fingers and feet cut off. He was a lesson for everyone. By the way, did he hear they were arguing about the candles? Vlad asked, so he already knows? His friend replied that rumors spread quickly, but no one seemed to believe them. Madame made candles, but Marcella wouldn't do that, right? Vlad replied that he had said so, and Jorge knew that too. They wouldn't do that. Harvin said that if it was them, they should at least have a reason. His friend asked him what reason. He replied that there was a 90% chance they needed money, urgently. His gaze grew serious, and he told him to be careful. The only time the organization would need to make money urgently was in the event of a war against another organization. The 5 heads who ruled the slums of Sora, the Knight of the Night Girls Jorge, the Pig Butcher, the Black Bear, the Gambler, the Dice, the Whale Hunter, Captain Hoover, and the Money Bug, One-Armed Jack. All the darkness of life, silently hidden in the shadows, would find them. After the conversation, he went back to work and, looking at the huge queue in front of him, thought that the darkness would find him like now. One-Armed Jack pointed at him with a hook and asked where his boss was. Vlad looked up at him intently and met his menacingly narrowed eyes. Accidents happen unexpectedly, and destruction happens unnoticed. He thought, did the Money Bug really come in person? Does that mean they are preparing for war? One of the men in the queue called him a brat and asked, did he hear what the boss said? Where is his boss? The protagonist looked away and frowned, pursing his lips. After that, he asked, who knows? He's just a candle seller, so he doesn't know anything. The man got angry and hissed through his teeth that he was a little idiot. He slammed his hand on the table, breaking the box of candles, and exclaimed that if he doesn't know, then let him go and find it. He didn't even flinch from this action and looked the man straight in the eyes while all the candles were flying around. They fell to the floor with a dull thud, and all the visitors of the house froze watching this scene. The girls got nervous, the drunks opened their mouths in surprise, and Zemina covered her mouth with her hands in shock. After a few seconds of silence, Vlad got up from his chair and started collecting the candles, saying that all the expensive goods were broken. He thought there would be no more sales today. Because of this, the man trembled with anger and, calling him an idiot, asked, "Doesn't he understand?" Suddenly Vlad interrupted him, saying that these stupid legs are here. The man didn't hear and asked in confusion, "What did he say?" He looked up at him with an irritated look and told him to remove his legs. He told him again to remove his stupid legs, which made the man boil with anger. Without thinking twice, he swung his leg and shouted that he was an idiot, and Vlad thought that the fight was a microcosm of war. An appointed battlefield, planned circumstances, and complete determination. Only in this way could he be sure of victory. Seeing someone else's soul in front of his face, he immediately grabbed his stick and swung it with a concentrated look, hitting his opponent in the legs. Because of this, the man almost lost his balance, and Vlad immediately swung in a new way, and the next blow landed on his opponent's face, knocking out his tooth. The girls and everyone else in the establishment were surprised by the sight, and Jack, it would seem, even liked it. The main character looked sternly down at his opponent. The immutable rules of the alley. The winner is on top, and the loser is on the bottom. The Moneybugs guys got very angry and exclaimed, "How dare he do this in front of them?" They were about to attack, but Jack raised his hand, ordering them to stop. They immediately froze, and he, running his fingers along his hook, said with a grin that he liked it. He only had one arm, so he hoped he would be understanding. Vlad replied that he did not discriminate against cripples. Hearing his answer, Jack laughed loudly and said that he was crazy, after which he touched his chin with the hook and lifted his face, saying that later they would talk face to face. Whose tramp did he take again? Vlad replied that judging by what he did not know, they died quickly. Suddenly, Georges' voice was heard from the side. He called out to the Moneybug and exclaimed, "What is going on here?" He approached him and said that if he had warned him that he was coming, he would have fried him some meat. Jack grinned and replied that they were not that close yet. The knight asked, since they had guests, maybe they would come up? The Moneybug rubbed the back of his head and smiled, and told the meat to go to hell. "Does he have any good alcohol?" Jorge frowned slightly and smiled, and said that Marcella never disappoints in hospitality, and Jack replied that in that case they would try. After that, he and his guys walked away, and Vlad sighed tiredly and quietly said that he almost died. After a while, he collected all the candles, and looking at the full box of broken goods, exclaimed, "How much did he break?" Behind him was Jack's voice, who called him a rising star. He approached him and smiled, and said that his boss did not refrain from compliments. Apparently he has a brilliant eye. When he gets tired of the smell of burning, let him come work for him. A guy like him will not bother him. Vlad replied that he liked it here too. They feed him, pay him, give him a place to sleep. One-armed Jack laughed and said that they could do that too. He threw him a coin and said what kind of candles they were. The protagonist caught the coin and thought, 1 gold? He frowned and said that was a lot. Jack grinned, saying that if he worked for him, he would give him as many as he wanted. Not for nothing was he called the Moneybug. He headed for the exit and waved his hand, saying that it was very tasty. They were already leaving. Looked after them. Vlad thought that he looked pleased. Did the deal work out? From the second floor, Zemina's voice was heard. She called out to her friend, and he looked up at her, after which she pointed her finger back and said that Jorge was calling him. He went upstairs and sat down at the bar next to the knight. The atmosphere in the room was oppressive. He looked down at the table in surprise and saw the dagger that Jorge had given him, saying that he had wanted to give it to him later, but that circumstances forced him to do it now. He looked up at him seriously and told him to keep it with him at all times. The protagonist remained silent and looked up at him, then looked at Marcella, who was very nervous. The others were also sitting in absolute silence. He could tell from the atmosphere in the room that Jorge and Jack's conversation had been a disaster. The knight said that he shouldn't sell candles anymore. Vlad asked what he should do then, collect money or patrol the area? He replied that they had received a tip that the one-armed Jack was attracting people from the outside, most likely mercenaries who had once been knights. Vlad asked, "Knights, how was he?" Georges' look became slightly upset, and he confirmed his words. The one-armed Jack had an incredible number of men, but even he had a hard time defeating the former knight. After all, a flock of sheep were no match for a wolf. But if he attracts swordsmen of the same level as the knight, the balance will be upset. Jorge said that they are at a disadvantage, so they need him. Vlad repeated in surprise, him? The knight said that he will give him his first task soon. Hearing this, the protagonist was surprised. He remembered Harvin, a cripple without fingers and even the ability to walk. Thanks to his sharp mind, he learned language and mathematics, and began to work for Captain Hoover. Looking at him, he realized, it is important to study diligently, because training will lead to the top. When he began to learn how to wield a sword, he began to hear voices in his head that told him how to swing correctly. Then he frowned and cursed, saying, "What is this with every swing?" A month ago, after a strike of pitch-black lightning, he began to hear a voice. The whisper of a demon begins to sound every time he picks up a sword or something similar. He gritted his teeth and said that before buying a sword, he needed to buy some holy water. He shook his head from side to side and told himself not to pay attention to it. They say that the more he answers, the more it will cling. He just needs to focus and try. He closed his eyes and stood in a stance, thinking that he needed to concentrate all his thoughts and strength, and then strike. He opened his eyes sharply, then swung his sword, but a voice in his head told him to bring his hands together, and he immediately obeyed. After that, he swung his sword through the air and hit the ground with a loud thud. He thought that everything had become different before he just swung, but now it looked more like the way of the sword. What the hell got into his head? After a while, somewhere in the forest in the middle of the snowy mountains, a knight was walking somewhere. He wiped the blood from his sword and said that age cannot be fooled. Now, the winter wind chills him to the bone. The knight's silence was diluted by some sounds behind him. He grinned and said that he understood everything. But is he a fool, or on purpose? He turned around and went towards the sound, the snow crunching under his feet. As soon as everything became quiet, he stopped and said that he didn't know who he was, but let him come out. "He's here." A few seconds later, a voice came from behind the tree asking if he was Sir Stanga. He confirmed his words, and when Vlad came out of hiding and showed his eyes, he asked if Vlad was him. He had heard that he was a guide from the slums. Looking around, he noticed that he was blonde with blue eyes. People must think he was a nobleman. Vlad handed him a letter and said that it was from his boss. Stanga unfolded it and asked if the competitors hired a man who used to be a knight. So that's why they needed his help. Vlad turned back to the forest and said that he would see him off then. They should be there in 2 days, by nightfall. He walked forward silently, and a few seconds later, Stanga let out a plaintive sigh. He folded the letter and said that he wasn't sure he would follow someone so stupid. The protagonist stopped and replied that he could at least take him. He replied that he didn't think so. He grinned menacingly and said that one cannot be smart at anything if he does such stupid things. Hearing this, Vlad became wary, and the man frowned and said that if he says "wrong road" on the way, he will kill him. The protagonist lingered his gaze on him for a few seconds and then turned around and told him to keep up. He does not want to fail his first task. Stanga was confused and thought, what was that? He deliberately assumed a threatening look and he just ignored him? He grinned and followed him, realizing why Jorge liked him so much. He is worth the effort invested in him. Time passed. They decided to stop for a rest in a small cave. Vlad lit a fire and then looked up at the knight, and he, noticing this, asked why he kept looking at him. Was this the first time he saw a retired knight? He replied that it was really the first time he saw him so close. Stanga asked what village he was from. Vlad did not answer and asked where he was from. He answered that he was from Diki, after which the protagonist laughed and sarcastically said that this place was just like a city. Stanga made a displeased face and put the sword tip on the ground, telling him not to push his luck, otherwise he might cut him in half. Vlad unwrapped the package with raw meat and told him not to say such scary things. He had heard that knight's jokes were threats. The knight immediately became interested in the contents of his package and asked if he would share it with him. Vlad replied that he was not given any more. Doesn't he have any food with him? He took some dried meat out of his pocket and looked at it with a little sadness, answering that he did. Vlad, meanwhile, impaled the meat on sticks and brought it to the fire, and the knight's mouth began to drool, and he thought that it smelled so delicious. He cleared his throat and asked, does he not want to ask him anything? He asked in response, why all of a sudden? Stanga replied that for a piece of meat he would answer one question. Such an opportunity does not come every day. Vlad began to chew the fried meat, silently looking at it, and then asked how much he needed. If he wanted, then he should just ask. Stanga irritably called him a brat and said that he had an honor. He crossed his arms over his chest and closed his eyes, saying that knights get everything in exchange for something. The protagonist noted that he was now retired. The former knight said that even now he adheres to this rule. Vlad did not let him finish and said that he would like to know his name. Stanga said his name, and then Vlad asked about his age, and he answered that he was 42. Since he asked such simple questions, he displeasedly called him a brat. After which Vlad immediately asked, does he at least know how to use aura? Stanga smiled, and said that now he could see that he was only innocent in appearance. Not all knights could handle aura, and using aura in real combat was something completely different. He asked, so could he or couldn't he? The former knight closed his eyes and smiled wryly, hesitating with an answer, and Vlad seemed to understand what he wanted, after which he handed him the meat and told him to take it all. Stanga looked in his direction and met his confident and interested gaze, after which he took the sword and said that a knight should only take what he could repay. There were times when he did what he wanted. But for the past few days he had only eaten jerky, so he would show him. He took the sword out of its sheath, and Vlad leaned forward with interest and thought, could he really look at this? After that, Stanga stood up and, closing his eyes, brought the sword to his face, pointing the tip upward. He concentrated, and then opened only his right eye, and Vlad asked why he left his left eye closed. He did not answer, and thought that he needed to generate peace from the depths of his soul. His left eye glowed blue, after which this glow moved to the sword. He suddenly opened his eye, and, splashing out streams of aura, accompanied by a light breeze, because of which Vlad covered his face, thought that this is the essence of knights. Soon, under the cover of night, they reached the walls of the city, and, having made their way through a small hole, found themselves in the slums. Stanga leaned his hands on his knees and sighed heavily, saying that he felt disgusting, like a vagabond. The protagonist replied that it was good that they were dirty. It was better to look like a vagabond than a knight. He replied that he was not talking about appearance, but about condition. He has a knight's honor. Why should he go through this hole? Vlad replied that he had been told to escort him secretly, so he couldn't go through the main gate. The knight remained silent, after which he told him to follow him. When they arrived, he would prepare a bath for him. Walking through the dark alleys where only their footsteps were heard, Stanga noticed that it was so quiet there that it was even alarming. Vlad replied that it was because it was night. Seeing something ahead, they both stopped abruptly. Stanga frowned, and with a serious expression on his face, he asked warily, was it always like this here? Vlad's face, on the contrary, became alarmed. He replied that it was not so. Seeing a pile of corpses ahead, he said that it seemed they had already fought. They needed to split up. He would tell them where the back entrance was, which only they knew about. The knight asked, what about him? The protagonist replied that he would go through the main one. It was better for them to split up now. He ran and said that they would see each other soon. Running to the door that was splattered with blood, he opened it and went inside. Going up to the third floor, he wiped the sweat from his chin and caught his breath, looking anxiously at the scattered plates and chairs inside mixed with blood. Jorge, whose wounds Marcelo was bandaging, said that he came back in one piece. That was good. The money bug attacked them first. It was obvious that those with money were on a completely different level. Vlad asked worriedly, was he okay? He glanced briefly at the knight's corpse to the side and replied that it had been a long time since he had encountered anyone on the knight's level. That was why it had ended like this. But first of all, he had brought him, hadn't he? Vlad confirmed his words and said that the main entrance was being watched. That's why he had told him to go through the back. He should have arrived by now. The knight's gaze became serious, and he said that that was good. Tomorrow they would attack the money bug. This time they would finish it. By the way, how is he? Is he okay? Vlad confirmed his words and said that he seems to be a good person. Jorge said that Stanga is strong, and Vlad added that he is quite modest. The knight asked, has he lost weight? Well, in order to live long, they need to take care of themselves. The protagonist confirmed his words and said with a smile that he also knows how to use aura. He is sure that tomorrow is their day. Hearing this, Jorge's face became very worried. Footsteps were heard on the stairs, and Vlad turned around, saying that he seems to be here already. Meanwhile, Stanga was slowly climbing up to them. Jorge worriedly called out to Vlad and asked, did he use aura? He confusedly confirmed his words and said that he himself saw it, after which the knight grabbed his sword and told him to stand behind him. Stanga does not know how to use aura. Vlad asked in confusion, what does he mean? At that moment, a door creaked behind him, and a knight appeared in the passage, introducing himself as Stanga. Vlad turned around in horror, and the knight told Jorge that he had settled too far away. He grinned and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. A few minutes before meeting Vlad, this man was wiping blood from his sword, and talking about how the winter wind chills you to the bone. Hearing sounds behind him, he turned around and, looking at the man lying in a pool of his own blood, said that he understood everything. But is he a fool? Or is he doing it on purpose? Behind him lay the real Sir Stanga, or rather his corpse. At that moment, the two knights stood opposite each other, and the main character hid behind Jorge. The knight, whose real name was Godin, said that he had changed a lot, and Jorge asked why he had come now. He replied that Count Gaidar had passed away. Jorge was very surprised when he heard this news, after which Godin poured alcohol into a glass and said that due to some complications, this was not announced, but soon everyone would know about it. He looked into the eyes of the former knight and saw a mixture of different emotions there. After that, he raised his glass and offered to drink to the poor Count Gaidar. At these words, Jorge became very angry and clenched his teeth and then rushed at him, shouting that he was a freak. When he began to swing his sword, the knight raised his glass again, after which his opponent struck, breaking everything that was in his path with peas. The glass of alcohol was cut exactly in two, but Godin was no longer in his place. Everyone in the room opened their eyes wide in surprise. The knight's black cloak flashed behind Jorge, and he offered him to drink to the new Count Gaidar, Siegmund. Hearing his voice behind him, Jorge shouted his name in rage, and then immediately turned around and struck. Their blades met each other with a ringing clang, and a grinding sound was heard when Jorge pressed harder on his opponent's sword. Godin told him about the Count's order to immediately return the deserting knight Jorge. He responded by shouting loudly that Siegmund was not his master. The knight replied that he did not expect him to return obediently. He looked into his eyes and said with a grin that he did not even hope for that. After that, there was a crash. Bottles of alcohol and mugs flew around, crashing with a ringing sound on the walls and floor. Jorge again attacked the knight in a rage, and he was focused. Taking quick steps, they approached and then moved away from each other. And at the moment when Jorge made a sharp forward and wanted to stab Godin with his sword, he quickly jumped back. Because of their blows, wooden boards flew everywhere, and Vlad, covering his face with his hands, led Marcella out of the room, saying that it was dangerous here. When Jorge attacked again, they had already approached the exit, and then found themselves outside and approached the railing. Burley, who was on the ground floor with his guys, called out to Vlad and asked what the noise was. The protagonist excitedly told him to call everyone here. He was about to tell him about Jorge, but at that moment, along with the wooden boards and chips, he flew out of the room. Noticing this, the protagonist and Marcella looked at him in horror, and a second later he flew over the railing and began to fall down, while Burley and the others looked at it in surprise. Godin came out of the destroyed passage of the room. He frowned and asked, "Is he still making naive decisions?" A moment later, Jorge fell with a crash onto the first floor, and the guys ran to the side, after which dust rose and they ran up to him, asking what happened. Their boss coughed because of the pain after the fall, and then tried to get up on trembling hands, and his opponent walked to the very edge and looked down at him. From the side, the whistle of a dagger cutting through the air was heard, flying straight at him. He immediately reacted and reflected the attack with his sword, and the dagger that Vlad threw stuck in the floor. They crossed each other's eyes, after which, Godin jumped over the railing and headed to the first floor. Seeing this, the protagonist worriedly called out to Jorge and told him to step aside. But after falling from the third floor, he was unable to do this. He was still trying to get up and sighed heavily, and a second later, Godin fell on top of him and swung his sword. Luckily, he managed to jump to the side in time. Sliding his knees on the wooden floor, Jorge stopped and squeezed the hilt of the sword tighter. Dust rose in the room again. Godin slowly got up, and then asked why he didn't just obey the order. The veins on Jorge's face bulged, and he said that he was a man, and he did not obey the orders of garbage. The knight's eyes flashed unkindly, and he sternly replied that it was not so. He was a knight. In response, Jorge only clenched his teeth, and then Burley and the rest of the guys stood behind him, holding their weapons at the ready. Looking at the small crowd of people in front of him, Godin said that the night had dragged on. He closed his eyes and concentrated, saying that now he wanted to rest. Vlad, meanwhile, was rushing to help. He was running down the stairs and at the same time watching what was happening. He saw a familiar glow around the knight's sword. His eyes opened wider and he screamed, realizing that he was going to use the aura. Godin, meanwhile, opened his eyes and Vlad screamed at him not to do it. Then everything seemed to slow down. Glowing lines resembling cuts appeared on the bodies and worried faces of the guys and Jorge. The knight's eyes, along with his sword, flashed blue, and a moment later he made many sharp swings, delivering accurate blows. Due to the bright glow of the aura, Vlad had to cover his face with his hand, and then the knight's black blows spread to the entire cathos, even going beyond it. Soon everything became quiet. All the tables, barrels of alcohol and columns were destroyed. Vlad, who was sitting on the floor, cleared his throat from the dust that had risen and looked up, asking what the hell happened. But he stopped mid-sentence when he saw a pile of corpses in front of him. Because of this sight, all the muscles in his face tensed and he clenched his teeth, cursing silently. Among a small cloud of dust to the side, he saw a silhouette approaching him. Noticing a familiar face, he looked up at it and called out to Jorge, but as soon as the person came closer, he immediately fell silent. Many drops of blood fell to the floor with a thud, and Vlad froze in place, his gaze becoming dumbfounded. Jorge was the first to extend his hand to the boy rolling in the mud of the alley, the first one to teach him. He was the strongest the boy had ever seen. But then a blue moonlight quietly appeared and villainously shattered the boy's world into pieces. Godin stood in front of him, holding Jorge's severed head in his hand. This sight was reflected in Vlad's devastated eyes. Without thinking, he immediately grabbed the first sword that came to hand and screamed loudly, standing up. A voice in his head told him to stop, but he did not listen. He was furious. He raised his sword with a scream, and then swung it right in front of the knight's face, who stepped back in time. Surprised by his movements, Godin thought, is this the way of the sword? How can a street boy know the way of the sword? He smirked and said that it was impressive, after which Vlad rushed towards him and pointed the tip of the sword forward, screaming at him to die. But before he could even get close, Godin kicked him in the stomach. From such a powerful blow, he was immediately thrown back and, falling to the floor, he slid along the boards and dropped the sword from his hands. Godin frowned slightly and looked at him closely, evaluating his movements. He thought that it was innate. He could not believe that he instinctively turned to parry the blow. Meanwhile, Vlad clutched his stomach and tried to take a few breaths, and the voice told him to breathe. He must not switch off. The knight thought that it was pointless to ruin his promising future, even if he returned with a sharper sword. He remembered the words of the knight from whom he was trained. He then said that it was always nice to see such potential. After that, the corners of his lips slightly lifted in a smile, and he, calling him the boy who served him, said that a knight takes only if he can give something in return. The main character raised an exhausted look at him and asked, "What is he talking about?" Godin threw 2 pieces of meat at him and said that his name was not Stanga and he was not 42. He had taken too much from him, so he would return it. He raised Jorge's head to show him and said that he would take it. It was an acceptable price and his right as the winner. Vlad looked up at him and, meeting his impassive face, hissed through his teeth that he would kill him. Godin closed his eyes and turned away from him, and then walked towards the exit and said that in his state he should not even ask for compensation for the pieces of meat. Listening to his retreating steps, the protagonist clenched his teeth and screamed that he would kill him. But Godin ignored him, and when he had already reached the door, Vlad called out his name and told him to wait. Tears began to flow from his eyes, and he desperately screamed that he should just wait for him. Soon after, he and Zemina left there. Throwing his arm over her shoulder and holding him, she helped him walk and looked at him worriedly. With the next step, a sharp pain shot into his stomach and he sank to one knee, grimacing in pain. He began to breathe heavily, trying to cope with it, and remembered what Marcella told him when the knight left. She walked up to him and told him to get up. She repeated it loudly and asked, "Does he want to die here?" He remained silent, staring at one point. Seeing this, she frowned, then slapped him in the face with her palm to sober him up, and told him to pull himself together. He finally began to pay attention to her and she asked, "Does he know what the difference is between the guys living in the city center and the losers?" She said with a serious face that these are opportunities. They are able to get up even if they once fell. After all, they can afford it. She waved her hand back, pointing to the corpses, and asked, "And them?" "Let him look. This is the result of one failure." She sat down opposite him and grabbed his shoulders, saying that they die if they fall once, that's their fate. Tears appeared in her eyes and she told him not to miss the only opportunity. Remembering her words, the protagonist pulled himself together and wiped the sweat from his face. Zemina asked if he was okay. Should they go slower? He replied that everything was fine. It couldn't end like this. A robber's voice was heard behind them, shouting that he had found him. Jorge's favorite was here. Realizing that they had been discovered, Vlad grabbed his friend by the hand and ran, and the robbers ran after them. Their nest had been destroyed. Even though they were just chicks, it was time for them to soar in the sky themselves. Soon they were able to hide, and the robbers stopped in an alley, wondering where they had run. Had those little rats run into another alley? The man told the others to check every nook and cranny. He would not skimp. He grinned menacingly, showing a row of holes in his teeth, and clenched his hand into a fist, saying that he would make him pay for his shame. He ordered them to split up and shouted that he couldn't have gotten far. Several men ran past the door, the bolt on which was broken. Vlad and Zemina were standing behind that door in the meantime, not making any unnecessary sounds. He thought that if things continued like this, they wouldn't be able to hide. He told Zemina to leave when everything calmed down. She asked in confusion what would happen to him. He answered that he needed to get out of here somehow. They were close, it was dangerous to move around together. She didn't agree and exclaimed that she wanted to stay with him. He said that she had promised Marcella that she would only help him find a good place and then leave. Let her return back or to Harvin before dawn. She answered loudly that she had said she didn't want to. He looked at her with displeasure and said that she wasn't listening to him at all. She was an idiot. It seemed like he would be able to protect her. She realized that he was right and started crying, trying to somehow object. Suddenly, an old man's voice was heard behind them, exclaiming, "Who's there?" They turned around immediately, after which Zemina rushed to the table and grabbed the knife. She pointed the weapon forward, and from the other room an old man came out to them, holding a kerosene lamp in his hands. He came closer to them and brought the lamp to his face. Now they saw that he was a blacksmith. He frowned and asked what they were doing here. Zemina squeezed the knife tighter and nervously told him not to move. He asked in confusion what was wrong with them. They were the ones who broke into his house. She shouted threateningly that she told him not to move, otherwise she would pierce him. The old man remained silent, looking at the intruders. He could tell from their faces that something had happened. After that, he said that he understood what situation they were in, so let them put down their weapons. She clenched her teeth, thinking about something, and then demanded the old man to give them the sword. He asked in surprise, what did she mean? She exclaimed that she wanted the sword he had hanging on the wall. It wasn't safe outside the city either. She wasn't joking, so let him give it to her. Vlad realized that things were going too far and told his friend to put the knife down, and she drowned out his words with her loud demands to bring the sword. Looking at her, the old man thought that this was what the slums were like. The true nature of people who need to take from others in order to lay out. Slightly squinting his eyes, he thought that he was the same. It seemed that it was her turn now. He said out loud that it was sad. Zemina desperately clenched her teeth, and as soon as she made up her mind, she squeezed the handle of the knife tighter and screamed. Realizing what was about to happen, Vlad tried to stop her, and the blacksmith only calmly closed his eyes. After that, she swung the knife, and what she saw made the protagonist surprised. She cut off her hair in one fell swoop, and the blacksmith opened his eyes, also surprised by this. She cried bitterly and handed him her hair, saying that it was not enough, but she would definitely repay him. She swears it. So she asks him to give him a sword. Watching her hair fall to the floor, the old man remained silent, thinking about something, and then looked up at Vlad and asked, "Are they leaving?" He confirmed his words, and he thought that this was the only thing he dreamed of doing in his life, but he never could, and this guy will do it. But he has not yet spread his wings. He tiredly rubbed the bridge of his nose and sighed, saying that they, the youth, make everything difficult for him. He turned his back on them and headed into another room, telling them to follow him. Soon they all went to the dump together, the blacksmith pulling a cart of garbage, Zemina walking behind, and Vlad lying in the garbage. She sighed discontentedly and said that it stinks, and the old man replied that this is the only way. Suddenly a robber's voice was heard from the side, calling out to the old man, and he immediately froze in place. Several guys came up to him and asked what he was doing here so late. The blacksmith nervously clenched his teeth and thought that they were idiots. "And they are here?" The guy looked behind him and, looking at the cart, asked, "Is he throwing out trash at such a time?" The blacksmith pointed his finger at them with displeasure and said that they were idiots. With their fights they blocked the entire alley. The forge almost burst from the accumulated trash that he could not throw out. The guy wanted to say something, but looking to the side, his gaze ran into Zemina, who was standing behind, her face hidden by a hood. He asked, "Who is this? Doesn't he work alone?" The blacksmith exclaimed that he was too tired to cope alone, so he gave her bread for her help. Or, do they want to help him themselves? The guy put his hand on the hilt of his sword and replied that since he was the only blacksmith in the area, he respected him. But he thought they should check who it was. He pried her hood up with the tip of his sword and told her not to move unless she wanted him to chop something off. After that, he swung his sword up and cut the fabric, looking at the girl with a wary look. And the old man became very nervous. Zemina immediately screwed up her face until it was unrecognizable and said that it was so hard for her to make a living. The guy was silent for a few seconds and then looked at her strangely and told the old man to drive on. He exclaimed, "What the hell is he even looking for?" The guy replied that they couldn't find George's kid, the blonde one. The blacksmith clicked his tongue in displeasure and asked if they could go. The robber replied that there was one more thing they needed to make sure of. He called a guy named Otor, and calling him an idiot, told him to check the cart. Hearing this, Vlad and everyone else became very nervous, and the robber said that he could check, but not here. Otor, who was holding a long stick with a sharp end in his hand, agreed, and the guy told the old man to follow him. The blacksmith cursed in his mind and thought, "Do they need to go somewhere else? They are not going anywhere." Otor approached the cart and began to look at the trash, saying that he had a lot of stuff here. He turned his gaze to the girl and lingered on her, and she, noticing this, pursed her lips and lowered her eyes. Otor immediately understood what was going on. After a short pause, he squeezed his stick and told them not to be angry. This is his job. He thrust the stick sharply into the pile of garbage, and Zemina, with tears in her eyes, immediately covered her face with her hands, and the blacksmith nervously clenched his teeth. Otor did this a few more times, after which he suddenly said that he heard Harvin launched a ship. Zemina and the old man looked at him with confused looks, and he, hitting the stick right next to Vlad, said that everyone went there. They think that he has some reason for this. Let them just mean it. He took the stick out of the garbage and stepped aside, telling them to pass. The old man walked on and nervously looked at Otor, and when the cart was level with him, he told Vlad that these were for the 40 silver that his brother, Ned, owed him. Hearing this, the protagonist smiled slightly, after which he thanked him, and they continued on their way. Soon they reached the wall of the city, where there was a garbage chute. Looking at the huge hole in front of him, the old man said that they were finally here. From here, the trash gets outside the city. Zemina burst into tears and said goodbye to Vlad, wishing him all the best, after which the blacksmith threw all the trash along with the main character out of the cart. Once inside, the trash crackled, and Vlad grabbed his sword tighter, so as not to lose it. The star he held in his hands was what the old man had created, putting his dreams into it, and what was paid for with maiden's tears. The blade sparkled in the moonlight, and then, together with its owner, fell into a mountain of trash. After a while, he went to the snowy forest at the foot of the mountains and stopped in a small cave. Sitting by the fire, he pulled the sword out of its sheath and raised it in front of him, looking at the blade. He asked if anyone could hear him. The voice confirmed his words, and he asked who he was. The voice answered that he did not know. The protagonist said that he knew so much about swords, but he didn't know who he was. The nameless one remained silent, and he said that he thought it was even for the best. They would help each other. He would help him return his memory, and he would be his sword. He frowned and, remembering Godin in the rays of moonlight, resolutely said that he didn't care even if he was the devil, because the only thing he was afraid of was that he was nothing. When he said the last words, the muscles in his face tensed with anger, and the nameless one agreed, saying that he would tell him about his sword. After a while, in the middle of a snowy clearing, there was a large camp with the emblem of Bayazid County. In the main tent was Joseph, the second son of the Bayazid family. He placed chess pieces on the map and thoughtfully said that it was too simple. He clenched his fist and frowned, repeating the same words, after which a knight named Jagger entered the tent and bowed slightly to him, saying that he had just returned. Joseph looked up at him and said that he was finally here. Jagger put his hand on the hilt of his sword and looked at his master, saying that something seemed to be bothering him. Is he worried about something? He closed his eyes and replied that everything was too simple. Jagger came closer and said that the monster hunt was going smoothly. There were few victims, all of them mercenaries. He asked if there were any more missing soldiers who could be considered deserters. Mediocre results in deserters. Everyone would doubt his ability to command. His father and vassals, that much was clear. And of course Rudiger, his half-brother on his father's side. Jagger remained silent, deciding not to answer, and his master thought that at this rate, the end would come. If he does not become the next count, then it will obviously be Rudiger. The Bayazid clan, famous for its army, has already left its mark on history. His father and his blood brothers were vying for the post. He told the knight that he did not have enough swordsmen besides him. He said that he still had something to inform him of. Joseph became interested and told him to speak, after which he said that there was a suspicious mercenary. His lord frowned slightly and asked, a spy sent by his brother? Jagger replied that he did not mean that. He would understand everything when he saw it. After that, they went outside and Jagger led his lord to the cut-up corpse of a goblin, hanging by its arms. Joseph covered his nose with a handkerchief because of the sharp stench, saying that it was disgusting. Most likely, it was killed by a child who had just started holding a sword. The knight pointed to the next corpses and asked him to take another look at this one. They approached another goblin together, and seeing exactly the same cuts as the previous one, Joseph said that this one was also a poor fellow. They were all the same. He walked on and, looking at the next goblin, noticed that this one was already better. He passed another one and said that this one was too. Suddenly a thought occurred to him. Are the cuts the same? They are both the same and different at the same time. He called out to Jaeger in surprise and told him just not to say that one person did it. He looked at the pile of hanging goblin corpses and asked, were they all killed by one person? Jaeger confirmed his words and said that these were killed yesterday, and those a month ago. The young gentleman's eyes widened in surprise. He lowered the handkerchief and thought that this was impossible. In just a month. He turned his gaze to the knight and asked, who is it? Meanwhile, blood was spilled in the forest, the goblins screamed loudly, and new cutting wounds kept appearing on their bodies. A group of mercenaries were fighting against the small monsters that were attacking fast. One man in the group told the others to get ready. They couldn't let them get away. The mercenary, who pulled his spear out of the goblin, put his foot on its corpse and said that the end was finally near. He looked towards his comrades and said with a smile on his face that they would get rid of them. But they didn't share his joy. They were all looking behind him in fear. He didn't understand why they were staring at him like that, and didn't notice that a huge hobgoblin was standing behind him, raising a club over him. Immediately after that, the hobgoblin waved his arms and struck, causing a roar to sound and snow to rise into the air. The legs of the man whose head was now crushed trembled, and the goblin looked up at the rest of the mercenaries. Their faces darkened, and they became nervous, after which the monster roared loudly and abruptly took off, heading straight for them. Because they were confused, they just froze in place, and as soon as the hobgoblin approached them, he punched the men who were standing in front. One of them shouted that this was madness. Where did he come from? Another man said that he broke through the fifth group. Everyone needed to retreat. They ran up to a knight named Vorden, who was sitting on a horse, and he, noticing this, exclaimed, "What are they doing? Let them quickly attack. Do they want to be paid for this?" The men exclaimed that they had not heard of hobgoblins here. They needed to hire better mercenaries or let him fight back himself. The knight said that they were idiots and then pulled his sword out of its sheath. At that moment, the body of a mercenary flew up to the feet of his horse. The hobgoblin mercilessly killed everyone who stood in his way and growled loudly, baring his sharp teeth. Afraid of being in the place of the others, Vorden pursed his lips and then put his sword back into its sheath and sighed heavily along with his horse. Suddenly, a young man came out of the frightened crowd. He had a sword and golden hair. He was heading straight for the goblin, and the others, noticing this, asked, "Is this Riemann?" One of them exclaimed that it was definitely him. "This is the praying Riemann." Vlad, who was known here by this name, put his hand on the hilt of his sword and confidently looked at the monster, telling the others that he would take it upon himself. Immediately after that, he pulled the sword out of the sheath and threw it aside, and he himself abruptly ran forward. He heard movement behind him. The hobgoblin turned around and growled. But at that moment, Vlad was already very close. He concentrated and swung his sword, striking and cutting the monster's side. Seeing the wound, he thought it was a weak blow, after which the goblin turned around sharply, and the nameless one told him to dodge. Seeing the monster's club very close, Vlad quickly reacted and jumped to the side, dodging. He turned around sharply, and sliding on the snow, stopped and cursed loudly, saying that he could not again. The voice called him a fool and asked, "Can he not even do what he tells him?" The protagonist made a dissatisfied face and thought that he must be a genius to do everything right away as he was told. He stood up and replied that he was just taking the long way. Meanwhile, the hobgoblin quickly rushed at him and, swinging his club, screamed loudly, and when he hit, Vlad ducked. When the monster swung again, the protagonist ducked again, then jumped back, and the club flew right in front of his face. The goblin got angry because he still couldn't hit, and then raised the club above his head again, after which he swung down with all his might, raising a cloud of snow. Everything became quiet. He waited a few seconds, and when the snow settled, he saw that there was no one nearby. Realizing that the man was alive, the monster looked around anxiously. Vlad, who was behind him, had already swung his sword with the thought that this time he would definitely chop him down. Feeling a presence behind his back, the monster immediately turned around, and at that moment the protagonist struck. Meanwhile, Jaeger told the young gentleman about the praying Riemann. Joseph became interested and told him to immediately find out about this man, after which the knight clenched his hand into a fist and brought it to his chest, answering that he understood. Joseph looked at the goblin corpses again and thought that there was no point in this. Crooked, sloppy blows. To think that he had walked the path of the sword in a month, he was a genius. Because of this thought, he chuckled, while the protagonist, meanwhile, rushed past the goblin and swung his sword, cutting off the upper part of his body, after which he confidently looked at his corpse. Since the last goblin was killed, a group of mercenaries began cleaning up. They took the goblin corpses and put them in carts. One of them sighed heavily and said that he thought that at least something good would come of this, because of the hobgoblins. A guy named Gotha called Vlad captain and said with delight that he did a great job this time. The protagonist put his sword back in its sheath and looked at him with displeasure, telling him to stop talking and to load those he had killed. He replied that they had already done it. Who would dare touch him? By the way, they were almost done. What was he going to do now? Was there anything else he needed? He wanted to say something else, but Vlad headed into the forest and interrupted him, saying that he did not work with scammers. Goethe was silent for a few seconds and frowned, then said that he meant the mercenary's badge. Vlad immediately stopped and the mercenary said that he did not have one. He knew a man who was very good at forging. The protagonist sternly pronounced his name, and then looked at him with a threatening look and said that he must know that talking kills. He thought that if this was a warning, he would just warn him, but if a threat, he would kill. Seeing his gaze, the smirk on Goethe's face immediately disappeared and he became nervous, confusedly telling the captain that he said it for his own good. It's a shame that he earns pennies with such skills. Vlad told him to shut up and continue cleaning. Or he wants to say goodbye to his head. The mercenary turned around and ran to the carts, saying that he was already on his way, and his captain looked after him and sighed in displeasure, thinking that sometimes something needs to be done with him. He turned around and, passing by the carts, headed into the forest. The man who noticed this asked his friend, "Is Riemann going to pray again?" He replied that he always does that. Vlad, meanwhile, got down on one knee and placed his sword in front of himself, bowing his head. The mercenaries said that he looked so cool. Perhaps he really is a nobleman. He is definitely not their equal. Vlad cursed and whispered to the nameless one that he couldn't beat him with one blow. He called him an idiot and said that he had told him that the one-hit, one-kill principle depended on the element of surprise. He asked what that even meant. The voice decided to explain it to him in plain language. When he picks up a sword, the enemy does whoosh, and then he goes bam. Vlad asked, how was he supposed to understand that? The nameless one asked, didn't he get it? He had just explained it. First the enemy does whoosh, and then he goes bam. The protagonist remained silent, and after a short pause quietly and awkwardly repeated, whoosh and bam. He cursed quietly, and the mercenaries gathered behind him and also began to pray, imitating him. A new day had dawned. Sitting down at the table with the others, Vlad looked at the bowl filled with brown liquid and took a closer look at it, asking, what kind of meat is this? This is meat, right? Goethe put a spoon in his mouth and chewed, answering that he did not know. What difference does it make if it is free? It is hard to find a place that feeds workers. Another mercenary answered that it was Bayazid, after all. The man sitting opposite agreed and said that the food was salty, but it was better than nothing. The protagonist left the table and leaving the food and told them to eat. They looked after him and asked each other, is the captain going to the priest again? Maybe he should start praying too? Someone answered that he would never be like him. A few minutes later, Vlad reached the priest's tent, and inside he was greeted by an old man with a smile. He greeted Father Andreas and asked how he slept. He answered that he always did. He heard that he prayed last night too. It was probably cold. Vlad thought that it was all stupid whoosh and bam, and answered the priest that he did not know, because he was in the arms of God. The Holy Father laughed and said that he looked more like a priest than he did. A little boy named John set the table and called out to the Holy Father that the food was ready. Andreas smiled and thanked him, and then sat Vlad down at the table, saying that he was just about to have breakfast, so he should join in too. He replied, confused, that he had not come to eat. But the Holy Father ignored his words and, sitting down at the table, folded his hands in prayer and closed his eyes, suggesting that they do the same. John and Vlad also folded their hands in prayer, and the Holy Father thanked the Almighty for this food, that he would send them strength and help them do good to others. He opened one eye, and looking at the young man sitting next to him, thought that he was such a sincere believer, that even in such a terrible place he did not lose faith. He needed to guide this young man, whose hands would always be bloody in battle. This must be the fate that God has bestowed upon him. He said the last words of prayer, and then, with a smile, told them to start eating. Vlad thanked him and turned his gaze to the table. In front of him lay fragrant wheat bread and soup. Unlike what the other mercenaries were given, this was real food. He took a bite of bread, and the Holy Father said that he would like to talk about his swordsmanship. He had heard a lot about it, but it seemed that Sir Joseph knew about it too. 2 days ago, he came and asked about him. The protagonist chewed the bread and asked, and what next? Andreas smiled and replied that he had given a recommendation for him. He said that he was looking forward to being promoted. Hearing this, Vlad was very surprised, and the Holy Father said that the Bayazids were a renowned family in the north. One opportunity to work for them gives much better conditions. He has the right to do so. Without answering, the protagonist nervously swallowed a piece of bread. After that, he went into the forest for another prayer and said that things were bad. Apparently, he was too noticeable. The voice answered that they had no choice. His skill could only be mastered through real experience. The bigger problem was his friendship with the priest. Vlad answered that he needed to test him. The Nameless One asked if he was finally sure now that he was not an evil creature. The protagonist said that Andreas was said to be respected and had great divine power, enough to become a bishop. If he saw nothing in him, then now he thought he was sure. Anyway, can they escape? The Nameless One answered that they would turn a blind eye to the fictitious name if he was capable enough. Vlad frowned and said that someday they would find out that he killed the mercenary who was stealing from him. Then he would be tried for both the fictitious name and the murder. The voice said that he was the villain, and Vlad pointed at the sword with his finger and said that he was his accomplice. The Nameless Man thought for a while and then said that he thought he had better run away. It could only be self-defense if there were witnesses. He would answer that they would then run at night. If they took Gutha with them, they could get a fake badge. The voice answered that he thought it might be really difficult. Someone was coming. It was a skilled knight. Hearing the warning, Vlad immediately turned around and pointed his sword at the knight. It turned out to be Jaeger. He stopped when he saw it. Vlad was still wary and pointed the tip at him, and he thought, did he sense his presence? It was better than he thought. After that, he said that Sir Joseph wanted to see him. Hearing the name of the Count's son, the protagonist stood up with the thought that he should have left at once and not hesitated. If he did not behave correctly, he could end up in a bad situation. He smiled slightly and replied that it was an honor for him, after which he thought that, as they say, composure is the most important part of the card game. Jaeger asked, does he know why he came? The protagonist answered that he heard from the priest, but did not think that he would come so soon. The knight thought it was interesting, a young guy, but was not at all afraid of him. He turned around and headed towards the camp, telling him to follow him. But Vlad did not move. He looked after him and hesitated, thinking, should he try to run away? The Nameless One immediately told him not to even try. He would not have time to take 3 steps, as he, a knight of such a level, would easily kill him. He cursed quietly and put his sword in its sheath, thinking that then he had no other choice. After that, he and the knight reached the main tent and went inside. Joseph, who was reading a book and did not pay attention to them, said that he was finally here. He was glad to meet him. Vlad bowed to him and said that it was an honor for him, after which the young master asked if he experienced any inconvenience in his work. He replied that thanks to his prudence, everything was fine. Joseph brought up the topic of his appearance and said that he thought he was from some noble family. He says his name is Riemann? The protagonist confirmed these words, and Joseph loudly slammed the book shut, saying that he should have said that earlier. Immediately after that, Jaeger hit Vlad in the face and some blood spurted from his mouth. He looked at the knight with confusion and met his imperturbable gaze, and the young master sternly said that he hated liars. Vlad wiped his mouth with his hand, and when the young master called him by name, he was very surprised. He asked, so he already knew? Joseph said that it was confirmed that his mother sold herself, but they could not find out who his father was. He looked at him with a keen gaze and asked, does he know? Vlad looked at him with an angry look and said that it was a good joke. He asks the son of a lady of the night who his father is. For such words, the knight hit him under the knee and he fell to the floor, letting out a painful sigh. Jaeger threw him a displeased look and told him to know when to stop. The protagonist just gritted his teeth and frowned. Joseph came closer to him and said that in fact, it really is a good joke. Looking down at him, he started talking about a group of mercenaries. They must have killed someone and brought him back. He already understood why he escaped from Sora. But where did he learn to handle a sword? Vlad became nervous and remained silent, looking at him with a confident look. Joseph looked into his eyes and said that there was so much hidden in them. To hurry him with an answer, the knight took the sword out of its sheath, and the protagonist, hearing the clang of steel behind his back, nervously bit his lower lip. He replied that it was a lightning strike, that it was his teacher, who had appeared out of nowhere. Joseph became interested and remained silent, listening further, and Vlad continued, saying that he had not given his name, but had said the following. The power of seeing extraordinary mastery should not be available to everyone. As he was saying this, Joseph noticed that his eyes were not moving. Deciding that he was not lying, he apologized for addressing him like that. The protagonist was nervous, but he kept a straight face and thought, did it work? Joseph said that he did not know about him, but he was in a difficult situation right now. So he had a proposal. He extended his hand to him and, calling him by name, asked if he wanted to take an even higher position. Power, freedom, survival, chivalry. That is exactly what he was talking about. Vlad looked up at him in surprise, and he said that he, Joseph Bayazid, wanted to support him. After some time passed after this conversation, Vlad and Jagger's wooden training swords crossed with another blow. The knight gracefully parried the blows, and the protagonist continued to attack. The mercenaries who watched their sparring from the side said that he held on so easily. It's all because he was being succumbed to. He became Jagger's student? He definitely has outstanding skills. How envious he is of them, that he even wants to join them. The knight swung back and then struck, but Vlad blocked his blow. Jagger said that he was a trickster. Should he have been so arrogant in front of Sir Joseph with such skills? Swinging his hand, he collided with his sword and told him to know his place. Vlad nervously held his sword out in front of him, thinking that they were of different levels. If he dodged, then he was behind him, and his blows were difficult to block. The knight swung his sword and Vlad realized what he should do. He raised his sword above his head, pointing the tip diagonally downwards, and when the enemy's weapon collided with his, he lowered it and the knight's blade slid downwards. Having completely thrown his sword off his blade, Vlad immediately swung, and then struck the enemy, gritting his teeth. The mercenaries were happy about this and said that he did it. He was very good. Jagger said that this was good. At least he could do this. The protagonist caught his breath after such a difficult sparring and realized that he had failed. He just let him show himself. The knight said that they would continue such sparring twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. Hearing this, Vlad's hand, wiping the sweat from his face, stopped abruptly, and he thought, twice? Jagger stepped aside and said that they would end it for now, so that he would not overexert himself. The protagonist waited until he walked away and then whispered that he had no sense of loyalty. He didn't even give him any advice. The nameless man replied that it was a good fight. He mercilessly chopped off everything that was extra to him. He would only understand such things in practice. Vlad made a dissatisfied face because he didn't support him, and rubbed his neck, saying that everyone was against him. Meanwhile, the knight returned to Joseph's tent, and he asked what he would tell now that he had seen everything for himself. Jagger replied that he was not bad. So much so that if he were from a noble family, the count would have noticed him himself. The young gentleman said that he knew his eyes didn't deceive him. The knight said that the problem was that he didn't know the limits and was quite arrogant. He replied that it was understandable. He grew up on the street. All he had to do was gradually learn etiquette. He thought that the right person was standing right in front of him. The knight remained silent, understanding what he was hinting at, and after a short pause said that one cannot trust a sword without loyalty. Joseph replied with a smile that even if he bowed his head at the sight of him, he still would not believe him. It was good that he had immediately shown his true nature. He remembered Vlad's words that he must definitely do something, and said that it was for the best. A wonderful relationship is when people give each other what they want. The knight bowed his head and, deciding not to object, obeyed him. His lord asked if he was not like a wolf? Arrogant, unreliable, living with a sense of superiority. He does not want to rush. It will take time to create a large cage, so large that the wolf could confuse it with freedom. Soon night fell. Goethe went to guard. Even standing by the fire he shivered from the cold and wondered why there was such a fog in winter. Who would have thought that the captain became Jagger's apprentice? He should have been noticed earlier. By the way, success is one thing, but to get into such a situation in such weather. Suddenly, Sir Roderick came up to him from behind. Hearing him talking to himself, he asked if everything was okay. Goethe turned around and greeted him excitedly, saying that it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. The knight told him to pull himself together and give it his all, at which point the mercenary bowed his head and said that he understood, so he shouldn't worry. Roderick continued walking through the forest, and Goethe looked after him and said that he was so strong that even a needle couldn't pierce him. He had gone on patrol, so he wouldn't be back for a while. He leaned his back against a tree and closed his eyes, thinking maybe he should take a nap for a while. After a few minutes, he was already starting to fall asleep, and suddenly, Roderick's voice was heard, asking what she was doing here. Because of this, the mercenary shuddered and thought, so he hasn't left yet? The knight asked, is she looking for the child? Goethe looked in the direction of the voice and wondered who he was talking to. Sir Roderick stood nearby and told the woman that she had gone mad, and she replied that she was just looking for her child. But on the last word she suddenly fell silent, and Goethe gripped his spear tighter, wondering why she had stopped. Starting to get nervous, he swallowed his saliva, and then moved away from the fire and carefully headed towards the knight. Noticing the movement, he suddenly froze in place. The knight went further into the forest, and Goethe wondered where he had gone. The camp was in the wrong direction. When he looked at it more closely, he noticed something very strange. Among the icy fog around Roderick, some kind of black smoke was flying. From what he saw the next second, the mercenary's eyes widened in fear. The terrifying ghost of a disfigured woman, which was the black haze, opened its mouth wide, approaching the knight's head. The next morning, after training with Jaeger, the protagonist stretched his shoulders and said that his whole body ached. He can't slow down? The nameless one called him a newbie and said that such an opportunity only comes once in a lifetime. Many are willing to pay for the opportunity to fight Jaeger because he is a knight of such caliber. Vlad remembered his withering look and said that he thinks he just wants to beat him up. The voice replied that thanks to this, the quality of the fight increases. Whatever the case, it is important. Throwing his sword over his shoulder, he said that it upsets him. Behind him, Goethe's quiet voice was heard calling him, and he turned around. A mercenary peeked out from behind a tree and waved at him, asking him to come here for a minute. Vlad walked towards him and asked when he got back. It seems that the team of fighters has not returned yet. Goethe looked around, looking for people, and then said that he will escape at night. The protagonist asked what he was talking about. The mercenary whispered to him not to forget that he came to find him. They should definitely meet later and have fun. Vlad frowned and asked what the hell he meant. Goethe asked to take his words seriously. He saw everything with his own eyes. He raised his index finger up and with a frightened expression said that this forest that they are capturing is cursed. The protagonist asked in confusion and surprise what he meant. Goethe asked, did he know that several soldiers escaped? Although the pay is good here, and the supplies are good. Vlad agreed with this, and the mercenary said that it was because the forest took them. They are not deserters, they are missing. The protagonist's eyes widened in amazement, and Goethe, remembering the wandering ghost, said that he had seen it all himself. There were ghosts in the forest that kidnapped people. After that, there was silence between them for a few seconds. Having finished playing along with him, Vlad raised his hand to hit him, and discontentedly called him a brat, saying that he needed to know when to stop, even if he was talking nonsense. Goethe covered his head with his hands and excitedly replied that he swears he is telling the truth. Yesterday even the knight disappeared. Hearing this, Vlad was truly surprised and interested. He asked, Sir Roderick? The mercenary confirmed his words and said that he checked on the way back and found something. Everyone who disappeared had black hair. After that, the protagonist took his words seriously, and at sunset they set off. Goethe, who was walking in front, almost cried and cursed in his mind, thinking that he should just pack his things and run, no matter the politeness. Behind him on his horse, Jaeger rode and Vlad walked with the rest of the mercenaries. The knight looked closely at the mercenary, who was walking nervously forward, and looked down at the apprentice, asking if he could be trusted. He replied that he would not, but he was not crazy. Jaeger looked back at the mercenary and thought that Sir Joseph considered this an opportunity, and not the usual show, fighting monsters. If they found something unusual, it would be more useful, but this worried him. He asked, were all the missing ones black-haired? Vlad said that there were 3 knights at this post, but they did not notice anything. Jaeger sighed and said that this meant that they were useless. He thought that he could not stay here either. If even Roderick was missing, someone more experienced should go. They reached the camp, and Goethe called out to the knight, saying that the team of fighters had returned. In the middle of the camp stood a large group of soldiers. One of them brought a clenched fist to his chest and bowed his head, saying that he was Aaron, Roderick's apprentice. Jaeger rode up to him on a horse and asked, did they comb the forest and find nothing? Aaron confirmed his words and said that despite the fact that experienced mercenaries were walking ahead, they did not find a trace. After listening to him, the knight thoughtfully looked into the forest with the thought that he needed to make sure for himself. He turned to the others and waved his hand, telling them to split into groups of 4 and explore the area. Let them spread out, but so that they were within sight of each other. Soon the sun would set below the horizon. It was approaching night, and everyone went searching. Goethe gritted his teeth in displeasure and glared at the captain, saying that this was not right. How could he do this to him? He was a swindler who took advantage of others. Vlad told him to stop talking and search. He would give him something later. Jaeger approached them and asked if they had found anything. They replied that they had not, after which he said that they were useless. The protagonist said that he was actually from the city, and the knight asked how they found missing people in the alleys. He replied that it was simple, they could catch someone and beat the information out of them. Hearing this, the knight's face darkened a little, and he said that he was really useless. He turned around and looked at the sky, thinking that the sun was setting, the day would soon be over. Maybe they should go back? But when he looked to the side, he noticed something interesting. There was a frozen river not far from them, and he asked, were they looking beyond the river? Goethe said that as far as he knew, he had not crossed the river, there was no such direction of attack. Jaeger thought that so far they had not found anything in the forest. They would not find Roderick and the unknown woman here. He resolutely looked ahead and ordered to gather all the mercenaries. They were crossing the river. Goethe obeyed his order, and then whistled loudly, calling everyone here. The knight meanwhile stepped on the ice and kicked it several times, saying that the ice was thin. Vlad sat down nearby and, examining the ice, said that it was because winter was ending, but they could still cross. Jaeger thought for a second and said that if they spread out, everything should work out. Meanwhile, the mercenaries ran up to them and one of them asked, "What is it? Have they found anything?" Goethe replied that they hadn't, after which the knight informed them that they were expanding the search area to the area beyond the river. Since the ice was thin, they would be crossing in groups. The mercenaries replied that they understood everything, and then split into several groups and spread out, starting to cross the river. Goethe sighed heavily, and the protagonist turned to him, asking, "What is it?" He bit his lip and nervously replied that he had a bad feeling. Vlad replied that he was just scared. The mercenary excitedly exclaimed that of course he was scared. He was not like him. People like him can only survive thanks to their intuition. His face darkened with fear, and he, looking at the other mercenaries, said that now his gut feeling was telling him not to cross the river. Vlad went ahead and said that he knew little about his gut feeling. But he knew one thing. If he ran away, he would die a nasty death. His face became serious, and he said that he would be the only one to run away from the scene. Even if it were him, he would kill himself. These words made Goethe even more scared, and his face twisted into a terrible grimace. Vlad stepped on the ice and told him to stop whining and go already. He would only survive if he crossed the river. Goethe followed him, and feeling something bad, nervously said that he was telling him not to go there. As soon as he took the first step onto the ice, it crunched. He froze in place and excitedly called out to the captain, asking if the ice could crack. He confirmed his words and said that if he chattered, it would break and he would fall into the water. Goethe became very scared and fell on all fours, panicking, saying that he could not walk anymore. Vlad grabbed him by the clothes and pulled him up, telling him to stand up, and only they remained. But suddenly the mercenary screamed very loudly and cried because of the horror of what he saw in front of him. The protagonist called him an idiot and asked if he was serious, but he stopped mid-sentence when he saw what made Goethe scream. Dozens of corpses of black-haired men were floating right under their feet, and the mercenary, stuttering with fear, alerted the others with a scream that there were corpses here. The others immediately stopped and turned around, and he screamed that the corpses were right in the river. Meanwhile, many dead people were rising from the bottom to the surface and stretching their hands towards the living. The ice under their feet immediately began to tremble, and they, feeling it, visibly tensed up. The ice began to break with a loud crack, and one of the mercenaries told the others to quickly cross the river. They ran faster to the shore but did not have time. One of the dead people broke the ice with his hand and climbed out, and the rest followed him. There were so many dead people that they formed a circle and drove the people into a trap. One of them exclaimed, "What is this even? They are surrounded." The mercenaries called out to the knight and excitedly asked what they should do now. Jaeger clenched his teeth and realized that this was a trap. This was a carefully prepared trap, as if they knew that they were coming. The sun had already begun to hide behind the mountains. He and the mercenaries became wary, and looking at the pile of dead people, thought that the night darkness was no place for the living. Soon it was getting dark. Meanwhile in the tent, the Holy Father was praying and thanking the Lord for watching over them. He asked him to continue to show the way with his light, but suddenly he fell silent. After waiting a few seconds, Zhang, who was sitting next to him, called out to him and saw that he was trembling all over. The water in the bowl on the altar suddenly changed color to black, and Andreas, seeing the dark aura emanating from it, turned to the Lord in horror. Now the camp was clearly visible, but a second later it was covered by a thick frosty fog, foreshadowing trouble. A black haze appeared, from which the ghost of a woman came out. She was heading towards the camp to find her child. Meanwhile, on the river, the dead attacked the living. Goethe backed away in horror and began waving his arms, calling for the captain. The dead man who attacked him suddenly froze in place, and a long cut appeared on his face. Immediately after that, Vlad cut his body in half, saving the mercenary. After dealing with him, he sighed heavily, but then he heard loud footsteps and a roar behind him. The dead were heading towards him. He squeezed the hilt of his sword tighter, and immediately turned around, and then struck one, and then the second dead man, starting to break forward further. Severed limbs and heads flew straight towards Gath, and he screamed loudly in fear. The protagonist called him an idiot and told him to get up and take a spear. He screamed in horror that he can't. Vlad cursed, and the nameless one told him not to panic. You need to think first and then act. The protagonist looked at the pile of dead in the distance and at those climbing out of the water, realizing that they cannot pass. He wonders if Sir Jaeger is okay. Meanwhile, the knight was dealing with the dead that surrounded him from all sides. He swung his sword deftly and chopped off limbs, not letting them approach him. But like any person, he soon began to get tired. A few beads of sweat ran down his face, and he turned his gaze to the others. The dead were sneaking up on him from all sides. They bit and grabbed the mercenaries with their hands. Jaeger gritted his teeth and thought that there was no end to them. They had planned this ambush well. He doesn't know who planned it, but he knows exactly who is behind it. His left eye under the bandage began to emit a green aura that transferred to his sword, and he thought that he had no time to waste. The dead immediately ran at him from all sides and jumped up, and as soon as they approached, he concentrated and clenched his teeth. After which small cuts appeared on the monsters' bodies at first, and then they deepened. Jaeger cut everyone who was close. Seeing this, the mercenaries rejoiced and told the rest to come here, with them Sir Knight. Cutting the body of the last dead man who attacked him, the knight called out to Vlad and ordered him to follow the agreement. The protagonist, who in the meantime pierced the dead man's head with his sword, turned around and called out to him in response, asking what he should do. Attacking, Jaeger told him to return to the camp and protect it at all costs. Let him protect Sir Joseph, as he should. Vlad frowned and obeyed the order, and then ran towards the camp and called out to Gotheth, telling him to follow him. The mercenary tried to get up and asked the captain to wait, and the knight looked after them and began to pray that they would reach the camp safe and sound. Meanwhile, he heard the heavy footsteps of a dead man behind him. He immediately turned around, ready to attack, but his eyes suddenly widened in surprise when he saw a familiar face. He sighed heavily and said that he seemed to be too late. Roderick stood in front of him. He and the rest of the dead men behind him rushed towards the knight. Meanwhile, everything was calm in the camp for now. Joseph was sitting at his table as usual and reading books, but suddenly some loud sighs with screams and requests to leave them alone were heard outside. Joseph immediately became wary and thought, "Is this an ambush?" Knight Vordan ran into the tent. He excitedly called out to the young master, and he, getting up from his chair, asked what was going on. Vordan caught his breath and wiped the sweat from his face, starting to mumble, and Joseph got angry and asked, "Did he burst in here without even finding out what was going on?" The knight nervously replied that his safety was first and foremost. At these words, the young gentleman became even more angry and shouted, "And that is why he came without a sword?" Vordan looked down at the scabbard and, not seeing the weapon, was surprised himself. Joseph gritted his teeth and said that his brother had been too kind to him. He would have hung him up already. Vordan bowed and closed his eyes, apologizing to him, and after that, 2 more knights entered the tent together with Andreas and Jang. The priest called out to the young gentleman and he asked what was going on here. The Holy Father showed him a trembling Bible and replied that there was evil here. Let him look at it. The Bible was written in holy ink. Hearing this, Joseph immediately realized that something was wrong, after which the Holy Father said that the letters were trembling like crazy. That meant that something powerful was heading their way. He asked if there was a way to stop it. The priest replied that he was certainly not an exorcist, but he would try to do everything possible with his divine powers. But he doubted that it would do any good. Joseph frowned and said that he understood, after which he thought that none of the knights had ever managed to create their own world. He looked up at the people standing in front of him and realized that they had no other choice. He walked past them and headed for the exit, telling the others to follow him. As soon as he left the tent, he immediately stopped. Seeing the fog in the camp, in the middle of which were the silhouettes of mercenaries, he became nervous. The mercenaries, as if under the influence of something, grabbed their heads and crawled through the snow, screaming that they were not her child. Realizing that something was wrong with the fog, Joseph immediately pinched his nose with a handkerchief and asked if this fog was causing the soldiers to hallucinate. Andreas followed his example and said that it was definitely not a natural phenomenon. Joseph thought that it seemed that he, too, had fallen under the influence. Suddenly the voice of a woman was heard calling for her child. Not far from the main tent, a ghost was wandering. She was crying and calling for her child, asking where he was. Seeing the evil with their own eyes, the priests and the rest, along with the young master, were horrified. Suddenly, the woman froze in place, as if she felt something. She looked ahead for a few seconds, and then suddenly turned in their direction and asked, "Is he here?" Seeing Joseph, she sighed with relief and extended her hand to him, saying that she had finally found him. Hearing this, he became very nervous, and when she approached and extended her hand to him again, something suddenly burned her. She screamed loudly and backed away, calling for her child. The priests knelt down and began to pray. They formed a protective barrier consisting of holy light, which scared away the ghost. The woman kept trying to get closer to them, but she was burned again, and Joseph thought, so only Sir Jaeger can defeat this monster. He looked at Kate and Maxim lying unconscious nearby and thought that they were not enough even with the blessing from Father Andreas. Despite the scorching light, the woman kept trying to break through to her child with tears in her eyes, and he frowned, thinking that it seemed like a curse meant for him. He clenched his teeth and thought, who could it be? Suddenly Zhang coughed up blood. He had used too much of his power. The Holy Father noticed this and told him to stay put. The sun would definitely rise again. Because he stopped maintaining the barrier, the woman began to break through. Noticing this, he wiped the blood from his lips and began to cry, after which he sat down again and began to pray. The holy barrier started working again, and the woman screamed loudly, having received burns. Joseph looked down at Zhang and realized that the priest was already at his limit. The psalm would soon end. He looked at the woman again and became nervous, thinking, is this the end? They are in such a bad situation that they can't wait for dawn. Suddenly his eyes widened when he saw Vlad's silhouette behind the ghost. Sensing someone else's presence, the woman immediately turned around, and he, shining in the blue light of the aura, rushed straight to her. A few minutes ago, when he had just reached the camp, he stopped, noticing the barrier. The Nameless One said that it was a product of the curse, therefore an ordinary blade could not harm her. Vlad looked out from behind the stone and asked what he should do then. The voice asked if he, by any chance, knew how to use the aura. In response, he asked, was he joking or something? The Nameless One remained silent, and after a short pause said that there was one way. The protagonist looked at the sword and asked which one. He replied that if he allowed him to borrow his body for a while. Vlad was slightly surprised and asked if that was even possible. The Nameless One said that he could use mana himself, but he was not sure if he could use it in his body. Even if it works, he won't be able to move for a while. So he wouldn't recommend it. The protagonist frowned and said that if he didn't kill this creature, he would be killed. The Nameless One replied that it was the way of the sword. After thinking for a few seconds, Vlad agreed and the voice asked, is he sure? The protagonist's gaze became confident and he said that he promised Joseph. It's his duty. He offers faith in exchange for loyalty. The Nameless One treated his decision with respect, after which Vlad ran out of hiding and approached the ghost. Noticing him, she turned around and screamed loudly. Seeing her tear-stained face, he seemed to sense something and gasped, after which the Nameless One said that it was time. Let him close his right eye. Vlad obediently closed his right eye and clenched his teeth, after which a thunderclap was heard. In an instant, he was transported to another space, where lightning swirled in a vortex, and thought in surprise, is this the world of the voice? Meanwhile, the Nameless One took control of his body. He suddenly opened his shining blue eyes, after which, the glow along with sparks of lightning passed to his sword. A powerful stream of wind emanating from him made the woman freeze in place, and he, meanwhile, swung his sword and concentratedly rushed forward. Swinging the sword from top to bottom, he made a deep cut, cutting off the upper part of her body. After which he rushed past, and everything around was illuminated by flashes of lightning. A bright light illuminated the exhausted face of the ghost. And everyone else, amazed by the sight, did not take their eyes off Vlad and opened their mouths wide in surprise. Joseph also looked very surprised. After he dealt such a powerful blow to the ghost of the woman, he stopped and, having lost all strength, fell to his knees. His whole body seemed to be pierced by lightning, and he screamed loudly in pain. Joseph called out to him worriedly, and he, having managed to survive such a sharp flash of pain, lowered his head and trembled. Joseph thought that just now those were definitely traces of the aura. He has no idea how he achieved this, but he is sure that he had to pay for it. But the woman was still alive. She reached out her hand to Vlad and began to call her child, and then crawled towards him, but he was still sitting in the snow and trembling in pain. Seeing this, Joseph hurried to help. He ran out of the circle and told the priests not to stop praying. Running up to Vlad, He threw his arm over his shoulder and helped him to stand up, telling him to hold on to him. He only sighed painfully, and the woman excitedly called her children and extended her hand to him. When Joseph was about to leave, she grabbed his leg and he, feeling the pain, fell on one knee. He gritted his teeth and tried to get up, cursing his body and wondering if he could even handle this. Suddenly Vorden called out to the young gentleman, then grabbed him by the clothes and asking him to forgive him for his insolence, turned around abruptly and threw the two of them towards the prayer circle. Seeing this, the woman reached out to her child and cried out sadly, after which Joseph and Vlad found themselves inside the barrier. The young gentleman stood up and told the knight that for the first time he was glad that he was on his side. He thanked him in return, and Vlad was finally able to move. He grabbed his weapon and stood up, asking the Holy Father to bless his sword. His face remained serious. He said that he needed to relieve this woman from suffering. Andreas looked at him in surprise, and after a short pause, he replied that he understood everything. After that, he took his sword in his hands, and, cutting his palm on its blade and staining it with blood, handed it back to him and said that he blessed his sword. Vlad took the weapon and thanked him, after which he went outside the barrier, and wiping the sweat from his face, headed towards the woman. He stopped in front of her and looked at her carefully, and she raised her eyes full of tears to him and asked him to help her find her child. Looking at her, his gaze became sad, when he just decided to attack her, then at least for a moment, but he saw a woman locked in a dungeon and a defenseless child on the cold floor. She stuck her hands through the iron bars and with tears in her eyes called for her child, who, along with the other babies, lay on the floor in the next cage. She again began to ask them to give her back her child. She could only beg while her child was dying before her eyes. This is the most terrible sight for a mother. Knowing all this, Vlad felt sorry for her. He raised his sword over her head and told her to rest in peace. She again asked where her child was. After that, he plunged the blade into her head and her blood splattered everywhere. She cried for the last time and, looking at the rising sun from behind the mountains, called her child. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, a man sat near a small cliff, leaning over a small box. He waved his hands, dispersing the black haze and smiling. The haze grew stronger, but at one moment it suddenly evaporated. Seeing this, he looked at the box in shock and thought that he no longer felt her presence. Was she killed? But who? Among them, only one knight can use aura. From the top of the small cliff where he was sitting, the knight's voice rang out, asking, "Is he the rat manipulating these dolls?" Hearing his voice, the man became nervous and froze in place. After a while, Jaeger returned to the camp and the young master, looking at his hand, asked, "Is it him? The one who controlled the dead in the darkness?" Jaeger, holding the man's head in his hand, replied that he thought it was him. In his other hand he was holding a small box. He said that he thought the woman was looking for this. It looked like a child's coffin. Joseph asked him to give it to the priest. They would investigate everything upon returning to Varna. Jaeger agreed, and his master, looking at the camp from the top of the cliff, said that it seemed their expedition had ended in failure. The knight apologized and said that he had no excuses, and he said that although it had been a complete failure, for some reason he felt relieved. Jaeger asked how the guy was. Joseph glanced at him, and then turned his gaze back to the camp, and with a slight smile said that it seemed he had found the right person. The one who would become his sword. He remembered how Vlad shone in the glitter of lightning, and said that he shone brighter than the others. Time passed. Vlad woke up and, sitting up in bed, asked in surprise, had he slept for 3 days? The Nameless One confirmed his words and told him to be careful next time. He didn't know the side effects would be so strong. He replied that he was glad. He thought they would pack up and leave right away, load him up like luggage. The voice replied that they must have been waiting for him to recover. Joseph seemed to be very worried about him. Vlad didn't answer. He leaned on his sword and got out of bed, then pushed the tent fabric aside and went outside. He looked around and saw no one. Said that the camp was empty. No wonder everyone ran away after so much trouble. Goithe's voice was heard from the side. He happily called out to the captain and asked, "Is he awake? Doesn't he know how worried he was about him?" The protagonist smiled slightly and asked, "Are you serious? The guy who ran away first came back." The mercenary smiled and replied that he had promised him a bonus upon his return. He carried it to the camp and even risked his life returning here with Sir Knight. Let him not forget about it. Vlad understood what he was hinting at and waved his hand, saying that he would tell them about him. Goethe said that Sir Jaeger told him to report to him when he regained consciousness, and Sir Joseph was in his tent. He thought he should go to him. Vlad went to the tent and waved his hand, wishing him a good shift, and the mercenary told him not to forget to tell about him. Did he understand everything? Vlad did not answer and sighed quietly, saying that he was so annoying. After that, he came to the tent, and the young gentleman poured alcohol into a glass, asking, "Is it okay for him to drink?" He confirmed his words and said that he once worked in a cath house, but never drank such expensive alcohol. Joseph looked at the bottle with a smile and said that this is a drink for aristocrats. First of all, he wanted to thank him. He could have escaped. Vlad asked, "Did they have a contract?" "Didn't they?" Joseph confirmed his words and said that he promised to swear faith, not loyalty. He thought that even though it was a verbal contract, he fulfilled its terms. He can't afford to lose such a guy. He looked at him closely and, remembering how he wielded aura, thought that he should make him his subordinate. He put a glass of alcohol in front of him and said that now it was his turn to fulfill the terms of the contract. He needed to reward him for his actions. Therefore, he wanted to officially invite him to the Bayazid family. The protagonist was very surprised by this news. After a while, they reached the Bayazid district, Varna. Jagger approached the young master and said that he had sent all the mercenaries. He replied that this was great, they should stop here for a day or two. He needed to report on the results of the expedition. Vlad, finding himself somewhere other than the slums for the first time, looked around the city's houses with curiosity. Jagger noticed this and asked if this was his first time here. The protagonist awkwardly scratched his head and replied that this was his first time everywhere. The knight closed his eyes and said that he was a country bumpkin, and he made a dissatisfied face. Joseph said that he could take a day off and walk around the city if he wanted. Vlad put his hands behind his back and bowed to him, thanking him for it, and the knight told him not to get lost. He should return to the city council building for dinner. He agreed, and when they left, he looked after them and mentally called the knight an old man. The nameless one said that it seemed that they were both crazy about him. He replied that they would strangle him someday from great love. Without taking this into account, since they were well paid for the expedition, they should eat something tasty. He wondered what this city was famous for. Suddenly, Jen gently grabbed his hand and called out to him. Vlad stopped and turned to him, asking how he could help him. The boy smiled and said that the priest would like to invite him if he was free. He asked in surprise and confusion, did he want to see him? After that, the little priest led him to the entrance of the temple. Vlad looked up to take in the whole thing and said that the temple was huge. Even the Sora church was not that big. Jung smiled and said that although the capital of Bayazid and Struma, the religious center was located here. He invited him to go inside and wait there. The priest would come soon. After that, Vlad entered the temple and, finding himself in a huge room, looked around in surprise. In front of him was a large altar decorated with gold, and, without taking his eyes off it, he thought that although he was called the praying Riemann, he never actually prayed. He scratched the back of his head awkwardly, and wondered why he felt guilty about it. Andreas, who came up to him from behind, called out to him and apologized for keeping him waiting. The protagonist turned around and replied with a smile that it was no big deal. He was grateful to be invited. The Holy Father laughed and said that he didn't need to thank him. He handed him a small wooden card and told him to take it. He didn't understand what it was, and Andreas explained that it was his personal card. He took the card in surprise, and the priest said that Sir Joseph had most likely prepared it for him too, but usually cards were given out in church, since the Lord's blessing is given everywhere. Vlad's eyes sparkled with delight when he saw that it was written on the card that his sponsor was Priest Andreas. The Holy Father patted him on the shoulder and smiled and told him not to hesitate to come to them in difficult times. From that moment on, he was his sponsor. Vlad looked at his kind eyes in surprise, realizing that he had acquired a sponsor, and then knelt before him in gratitude. A kid from the back alley like him, who didn't even have a birth certificate, was able to acquire a sponsor and write his name in this huge world. From that day on, he was no longer Vlad of the slums, but Vlad of Sora. Soon after, they set off on their journey. Walking next to the young gentleman's carriage, Vlad began to listen as he talked about the county. Bayazid County consists of 12 small and 3 large cities: the logistics center, Sora, the religious center, Varna. He looked at the gates of the huge city in front of him and said that this was the 3rd city, the capital, Struma. Soon they reached the palace of the Count and Jaeger. Stopping Gotha and Vlad at the door to the waiting room, said that they were now guests of Sir Joseph. Let them keep in mind that any stupid action will affect his reputation. They can't run around here like country bumpkins. Let them sit quietly. They agreed, and the knight said that the servants will soon bring snacks. He wanted to say something else, but stopped mid-sentence, and they both looked at him questioningly. He turned away from them and told them to just wait and not eat anything. If they eat like barbarians, then only bad rumors will spread about them. Vlad asked, but a little is okay, right? The knight went further down the corridor and told him to be quiet. Let them just not eat anything. After that, they both entered the room and Goethe, looking around the luxurious interior, asked in surprise, "Is this a reception room?" He looked around the room and said that the Bayazid are very cool. Vlad replied that he knew it. Suddenly a man's voice was heard from the side, who said that he had never met them before. They both stopped and looked at the swaying tool, behind which the stranger was hiding. He cursed and said that he wanted to quietly laze around here. After that, he came out from behind the tool and, taking a few steps towards them, stopped, showing himself to them. Vlad looked up at his face in confusion and was suddenly surprised. He looked a little like Joseph. It was Rudiger. He looked at them and asked who they were. The main character got nervous and thought that he looked familiar, but the aura was on a completely different level. He imagined a wolf with eyes that burned with fire and thought that he could cut a man in half with just one look. Goethe bowed to him nervously and introduced himself, saying that they had accompanied Sir Joseph on an expedition. Rudiger replied that he understood, then turned his gaze to Vlad and wanted to ask who he was, but he did not let him do so and immediately introduced himself, saying that he was Vlad from Sora. He asked who he was. It was the first time he had heard of such a thing. He looked closely at his confident gaze and thought that his eyes were full of growth, and he did not hide it at all. Was he self-confident even in front of him? It seemed that Joseph had gotten his hands on a very useful guy. He liked him. He took a handful of nuts out of his pocket and then extended his hand towards them and opened his palm, asking if they wanted peanuts. Vlad looked down at the nuts, thought about something for a few seconds, and then replied that they had been told not to eat them. Rudiger didn't understand at first and looked at him with confusion, and he repeated with a confident look that they were told not to eat anything here. Hearing this, Goethe was very surprised and nervous, thinking that he was crazy. How can he refuse high-ranking people? Rudiger awkwardly asked, "Is it really true?" The first thing Vlad of Sora did in the Bayazid house was refuse peanuts offered to him by the Count's eldest son. Rudiger threw a few nuts into his mouth and chewed, saying that they were actually very tasty. Meanwhile, Joseph was in his father's office and told him about Vlad. The Count, without looking up from his work, replied that he understood. They didn't have anyone special except Jaeger, whom his mother brought. If he could raise him to be as good a knight as everyone else in their family, he would reward him. His son bowed slightly and thanked him, after which he said that he understood that the sword was not his strong point, but he should not forget that he was a Bayazid. Joseph bowed his head and agreed, and his father asked if he was feeling better. He briefly confirmed his words and the Count said that he could go. Joseph bowed to him again and wished him a good rest, and then turned and walked to the door. His father looked after him and looked down at his feet. He was limping on one leg. He told a man named Ragmus who was standing nearby that they needed to give him some medicine, and he replied that he would certainly be glad, as would Lady Oksana. The Count smiled and agreed, saying that she was very caring towards her son. By the way, what did he think of this? He was referring to Joseph's report. Ragmus replied that they needed to take this seriously. Strange things were happening, one after another. The Count's face turned angry and he said that they needed to find out who was behind this. How dare they do such a thing on his land? Ragmus said that there was a report from Varna after all. Indeed, an interesting combination of the risen dead and curses. They believe that it was the work of either a great dark mage or someone weaker. The Count said that if there were more of them, it could be a whole group or an organization. Ragmus agreed, and he, rising from his chair, said that in any case, it did not change anything. He went to the exit of the office and said that their house must remain unshakable. They were ready to do whatever it took to get rid of those who dared to stand in their way. He looked at Ragmus and with a threatening face, said that he hoped he would find them soon. Those who threatened his son and created chaos on his land. Soon night fell. Joseph, along with Jaeger, entered the reception room, and he said that the report took longer than he expected. Had they waited long? Goethe replied excitedly that this was not the case at all. The young gentleman asked, "He was Goethe, right?" He confirmed with a smile on his face. His eyes widened, and he said that they would talk about his reward tomorrow. All of Goethe's joy immediately evaporated, since he had been sitting hungry all day waiting for his reward. Joseph said that the servants would show him his bedroom, so he could rest. Goethe rubbed his neck in frustration and walked toward the exit, saying that he understood. Joseph, meanwhile, sat down on the chair in front of Vlad, crossed his legs, and offered to talk to him. He had saved his life and had decided to dedicate his sword to him. Is that right? Vlad confirmed his words, and he continued by saying that he had said that he had a mission, and that he understood this to mean that he should be free. The protagonist confirmed his words again, and the young gentleman said that he had said that he would dedicate his sword to him. But in contradiction, he wanted to be free. They needed to clarify this. What exactly did he want to do with his freedom? If he says, he will think about whether he can give it to him. Vlad's confident eyes looked up at the moon that was visible through the window behind the young master. He said that he wanted to find a knight who resembled the blue moonlight. His gaze became full of fury and he asked, "Does he know Godin of Gaidar?" Hearing this, a thought arose in Joseph's mind that he thought he was just a useful guy. "And does he have such an unusual story?" he asked. "So the unknown one who destroyed the Cath House of Rose Smiles is Godin of Gaidar?" Vlad thought that he would never forget him. He killed his savior, destroyed the world he lived in. But he can't help but admire him. He confirmed the words of the Count's son, and he, thoughtfully folding his hands together, after a short pause answered that he could not help him in any way. He is beyond his influence. The protagonist's face darkened with disappointment and he asked, "Is that so?" He thought he had expected something like this. After all, he was only the son of a count. But he was grateful that he had told him the truth. He wanted to say something, but Joseph beat him to it and offered to change the terms. He looked up at him seriously and said that he was offering him a contract for 7 years. Vlad was surprised and a little confused by this offer, and Joseph said that he must not know, but he had put his honor as an aristocrat aside. Let him mean that it took a lot of determination. Vlad looked at Jaeger and, meeting his fierce gaze, thought that he did not know too much, but it seemed like this was an unprecedented case. Joseph said that he promised him a wonderful future for saving him. During these 7 years, he would clothe him, feed him, train him. He would raise a knight who would be able to do anything, no matter how far he went. Hearing the word knight, Vlad was very surprised. This was what he had always wanted. Joseph continued by saying that in turn, he would be loyal to him and would only do what he said and allowed. Of course, he would not be allowed to do anything related to Godin. However, he did allow him to do things related to the Sora slums. He could help him with that. He heard that Zemina was currently living in a monastery. Hearing his friend's name, the protagonist's face darkened, and Joseph asked what he could achieve with just a sword in his hands. After all, a sword is not the only sharp weapon. He also has his own weapon. He looked at him with a serious and thoughtful look and asked what he would do. After Vlad gave his answer and left, Joseph went to the window and said that he was aiming for great things. The knight asked why he was so insistent on achieving great things. He could find as many useful guys as he wanted. He replied that he could, and they all had potential. But whether anything would work out was a completely different matter. Jaeger asked if he hoped that he would live up to his expectations. Joseph did not answer right away. He looked at the night sky, remembering his fight with the ghost, and confirmed the knight's words and added that he had clearly seen it with his own eyes. Jaeger said that he was not only unpredictable, but also extremely disobedient. It would be difficult to deal with him. The young master turned his gaze to him and asked, "He does have him, right? 7 years is a long time. Enough to tie him up, appease him, and pacify him." The knight humbly closed his eyes and replied that he would do his best then. Joseph said that the more difficult it was to deal with him, the better the result would be. He turned to the window again and said that he thought he was just a useful wolf cub. But it turned out that he was actually a wolf chasing the moon. A new day had dawned. Jaeger took Vlad to his room and said that this was his personal room for one. He gasped in delight and said that it looked beautiful. Clean floor, and there's even a bed. It's a palace. Jaeger was surprised at first that he was happy with such a modest room, and then said that he forgot that he was from the slums. Usually, all vassals are from good families. It's hard for them to adapt to this. He sighed and said that he would succeed if he didn't screw up. Because of these words, Vlad shuddered and looked up at him nervously, asking, "Is he talking about peanuts?" Jaeger told him to forget about it. It didn't seem like he was listening to him from the beginning. The protagonist thought that he beat him up for it anyway. After that, he left the room and said that after he ate, he should come to the training ground. They would fight twice a day, morning and evening, like on the expedition. But suddenly he stopped, seeing movement towards him. Lady Oksana was walking towards him with her retinue. Noticing him, she smiled and said that he was her faithful knight. Vlad left the room, and Jaeger whispered to him that this was Lady Oksana, Sir Joseph's mother. Let him greet her respectfully according to the rules of etiquette, as they had taught. He and his student bowed and greeted the lady, and she wished them good morning. She looked down at the boy standing next to the knight and asked, "Is it he?" Jaeger confirmed her words and said that Sir Joseph had personally invited him. She looked at him carefully and replied that she understood. Vlad opened his eyes and looked up at her with interest, and seeing how she smiled tenderly while looking at him, he immediately lowered his eyes in embarrassment and shuddered slightly. She thanked him and asked, "Was it he who saved her son?" He nervously replied that he was simply doing his duty. She came closer to him and said that she should reward him. He had done more than he imagined. He wanted to thank her for these words, but suddenly she stroked his hair and said that it was a beautiful color. It suited his blue eyes very well. She felt his body and said that he had very broad shoulders for such a thin person. He needed to gain weight. It would look better that way. Soon she would send him clothes. From these actions on her part, Vlad became even more embarrassed and nervous, thanking her again. She smiled tenderly and kindly again, and then turned around and told Sir Jaeger to continue. He wished her a good day, and as soon as she left, Vlad straightened up and sighed with relief. The knight asked in surprise, "What was that just now? Was he always like this? Why was he so restless?" He still nervously answered that he had never met a woman of noble blood before. Jaeger said that for the first time it was not bad, to be honest, even he had a hard time talking to Lady Oksana. He walked down the corridor and invited him to go and eat. After that, he came to the dining room, where there were many other people. When Vlad sat down at the table with his food, one of the vassals named Sobanin came up to him and, pulling out more snot from his nose, spat into his soup. He smirked and looked at him to see his reaction, and then mockingly apologized and asked, "What will he do now?" He confused him with a trash can. He, along with the other guys, laughed loudly, and Vlad looked down at his soup. After that, he silently scooped up his saliva with a spoon and threw it out of the plate, throwing it behind him. He calmly scooped up the soup with a spoon, now cleared of all impurities, and thought that this happened earlier than he expected. Sobanin looked at his face in confusion and thought, "What is wrong with him? Why is he so calm?" The protagonist remembered Jagger's words that now every action of his would reflect on Joseph's reputation, and calmly eating his soup, he thought how he could beat him if it would reflect on him. The guy, clearly unhappy with the result, walked away from him and said that it made him so angry. They finally had the opportunity to laugh at someone. Unexpectedly for him, Vlad asked his name. Sobanin stopped and turned around, asking what he said. Vlad glanced at him sideways with eyes full of rage and said that he asked his name. His gaze made the guy nervous and sweaty, thinking what kind of incredible aura was this. He introduced himself to Vlad, and he, getting up from the table, repeated his name and went to the exit, threateningly saying that he would remember it. Time passed. The Count and Ragmus walked along the wall and suddenly heard loud sounds from the side. He walked to the edge and looked at the training ground and said that they looked like they were training. They needed to watch. Ragmus agreed and stood next to him, and the Count, finding Vlad with his eyes, asked, "Is that him?" He heard that he was blonde. He looks smart. Ragmus looked to the side and called out to him, saying that there was something over there. The Count turned to the side and Ragmus, noticing a man on the other wall of the training ground, said that someone was watching there. It was Jaeger. He was hiding and watching his student, and the Count said that the first time is always restless. He crossed his arms over his chest and suggested that he see what he was capable of. The protagonist, meanwhile, took a training sword and went to the ground, and then began to fight with one of Sobanin's friends. Their wooden swords met each other with a loud bang, and then Vlad began to deliver new blows, pushing back his opponent. He gritted his teeth and became nervous, dodging, and when Vlad struck again, the Count said that he was fierce. His opponent was much taller than him. He was reckless. Ragmus asked, did he think so? He replied that he had something in him. It was commendable. Even though he was clumsy, he was trying his best to use what he had learned. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued sparring, remembering the words of the mentor that everyone started with the placement of their feet. He could instill fear in the opponent with his footwork, shoulders, and his gaze. He took the right stance, and when his opponent swung his sword, he ducked down and concentrated on watching his movements, thinking that he could control the opponent with his movements. The opponent was about to strike when he swung his sword, and at that moment, Vlad abruptly moved to the right side. Obviously not expecting this, the guy got very nervous, and then Vlad suddenly approached him and, looking him straight in the eyes, delivered a powerful blow, after which he ended up behind him. The guy grabbed his hit side and caught his breath, with the thought that he was definitely aiming to the left. Suddenly, the protagonist grabbed him by the hair and lifted his head. He clenched his other hand into a fist, calling him a supporter of Sobanin, and asked if he enjoyed laughing in the dining room. His gaze became fierce, and he told him to giggle a little more. Immediately after these words, he punched him in the face with his fist, causing blood to spurt from his nose, and the rest of the vassals on the training ground froze, looking at this in surprise. Ragmus said that he understood that they were training, but is it normal for him to hit him like that? The Count nodded and replied that so be it. To become a knight, a strong spirit is needed. He looked at Jaeger, who was watching his student, and said that he seemed to like it. Ragmus agreed, and Vlad continued to beat the guy in the meantime. Another guy ran up to them and told him to stop. But he ignored him, and he ordered him to stop again, asking if he considered him a nobody. Right after these words, Vlad's fist, which was ready to hit his opponent again, suddenly froze in the air. He let go of the guy's head, and he fell to the ground with a crash. He looked down at him and then apologized to his friends for getting carried away. Seeing his indifferent and at the same time fierce look, the guy nervously swallowed his saliva and thought, "What kind of look is that?" After that, he began to examine his friend, and Vlad walked forward. When he caught up with Sobanin, he stopped, looked at him with a slight smile, and asked him to tell him that he was sorry. He couldn't come to his senses. He was so carried away. Sobanin got very angry at this and hissed through his teeth that he was an idiot, and then Vlad walked around him and said that he wanted to apologize to him in advance. He walked past him and said at last that it would not end there. He would call him to spit in the soup if it was bland. Sobanin turned around and, looking after him, clenched his teeth with the thought that this idiot was really crazy. Sir Joseph brought a mad dog from the slums. Time passed. Vlad came to the dining room with Gotha, and he asked, had he heard that he had beaten up the other vassals? There was a rumor among the servants. The protagonist bit off a piece of sausage and asked, how was he doing? Is the work within his power? He smiled and, confirming his words, asked, does he think he is an ordinary groom? He is the groom of the great Count Bayazid. Suddenly, the smile disappeared from his face and he said that it didn't matter now. He heard that he was beating the crap out of kids all over the estate. It was a crime, wasn't it? Vlad asked why he was acting like it was some kind of news. Had he forgotten? He had always been a criminal. He was the one who felt sorry for them. Remembering this, Goethe had to agree. The protagonist said that of course he didn't beat them up for no reason. They suggested it themselves. He asked why he thought it was okay. He replied that no one talked to him unnecessarily anymore. It was more convenient and better. Their conversation was interrupted by a guy who came up to them and awkwardly greeted them. He smiled nervously and said that his name was Portly Canner. Goethe looked at him with interest, and Vlad asked what his business was. Portly hesitated with an answer, and the protagonist, seeing a tray of food in his hands, told him to sit down or leave. Let him not stand there. He was delighted, and asked with delight in his eyes, is it true? He sat down next to him and thanked him with a smile for offering him a seat. Chewing a sausage, Vlad frowned with displeasure and mentally told him that he meant to leave. Portly smiled crookedly and said that he always ate alone, in the toilet or something like that. Vlad asked, didn't he see that he was still eating? He was just about to bite into this precious sausage. His new acquaintance asked, delicious, isn't it? He smiled and proudly said that these sausages were supplied by his father. His family supplies everything here and the meat. They have been in the cattle business for generations. He saw him recently taking more sausages. Maybe he wants more? The protagonist looked at him suspiciously and asked what he was up to. Did he really think he could be bribed with sausages? After that, his new acquaintance led them to his room, where a lot of different meats were stored. He said that his father sent it to him so that he could eat. But he couldn't eat it alone. Seeing so much meat, Vlad thought with a smile that all the vassals here were children from great families. He forgot that they were the kind of people he would never talk to if he lived in the slums. It would be nice to make at least one useful acquaintance here, right? Goethe was already drooling over the meat paradise, and the protagonist called out to Portly and asked if they could eat together from now on. He was very happy with this offer and asked, is it true? Do they mind? Vlad patted him on the back in a friendly manner and confirmed his words, saying that they would definitely get along, after which he thought that he was not doing this for the sausages. Time passed. Sir Jaeger was walking somewhere along the corridor with thoughts that serving Sir Joseph and raising a kid is not so easy. He hopes that Cade and Maxim will recover quickly and help him in the future. Suddenly Sir Gregory called out to him, and he stopped, after which he asked where he was in such a hurry. Jaeger looked at him, then greeted him, cursing in his mind. Gregory laughed and said that his displeasure was too noticeable. The knight replied that as he saw, he was a little busy at the moment. Gregory waved his hand with a smile and replied that he was not surprised. He must be very busy, single-handedly performing all of Sir Joseph's tasks. Jaeger asked if he wanted to say something. He replied that a man like him should start raising an apprentice. To be honest, he doesn't think it's too late. The knight looked at him with displeasure and asked if he should focus on his student. He wondered why he was suddenly talking about this. Gregory rubbed his neck with a laugh and replied that his dear Portly was already quite an adult. He needed to lose some weight. Jaeger asked, so what does he want? The knight awkwardly started talking about Vlad and said that he thought he was good. He smiled awkwardly and added that he was courageous and strong in spirit. Jaeger tilted his head to the side and crossed his arms, saying that he said he was busy. What does he want? Gregory awkwardly said that as far as he knew, it wasn't quite right for a knight to interfere in his students' affairs. It didn't look very good. It seemed that Vlad had warmed up to Portly lately. Jaeger replied that the guy had no friends at all. He thought you were the best. Despite this, Gregory asked him to tell him to make friends with his student. He is his cousin's nephew, and he cannot allow himself to be bullied here. And it is useless to ask others. He has already tried asking other kids about it. Jaeger seemed interested and asked, for free? Gregory was glad that he managed to interest him and hit himself on the chest with his fist, saying that if everything worked out, then he could come to him for help later. Jaeger looked away thoughtfully and replied that he was not listening to him. Gregory said that he seemed to be making progress. The knight replied that he said so, he really was not listening to him. But Gregory continued to insist on his own, saying that he was really making progress. Meanwhile, Vlad was sitting in the stable with his friend. Goethe said that from what he saw, it was not his fault. He could not even mount a horse, but they were all well trained. They were not afraid of people. However, when he approached, they got scared and ran away. This definitely has nothing to do with skills. The other groom also said that it was strange. The protagonist made a displeased face and cursed, thinking that it had always been like this. Dogs, cats, all animals hate him. They get scared when he passes by. Is it the same with horses? Suddenly his eyes widened in surprise. He remembered how he and Goethe rode a horse to the camp on the night of the dead, and said that then he rode on Sir Jaeger's horse, although he was not holding the reins. Goethe said that Sir Knight's horse was very expensive. Vlad frowned and thought, then looked down and thought that this meant that he could only ride expensive horses. But he couldn't just say that. He insisted that he learn to ride at any cost. One of the maids came into the stable. She approached them, then smiled slightly and said that Mrs. Oksana had called him. Vlad looked at her in surprise and asked, "Did Mrs. Oksana really call him?" Time passed. Lady Oksana smiled and asked, "Who would have thought that he grew up in the slums?" She looked at his new clothes and said that they suited him very well. Meanwhile, he straightened up and became nervous, not daring to move from the spot. Oksana told the tailor not to adjust the clothes too closely. After all, he was 17 years old, he was still growing. Her son had grown a lot at that age. He only nodded in response, after which she told Vlad with a smile that when summer came, she would give him other clothes. After all, wearing clothes according to the season is necessary for maintaining physical fitness. He lowered his head and thanked her sheepishly, and she said that he saved her son's life. She should be the one thanking him. She apologized for calling him when he was busy training. Now he could go. He bowed to her and thanked her, and then left. Closing the doors behind him, he stopped to catch his breath, and with a tortured face said that for some reason he found it so difficult with her. He looked at his new clothes and thought, how much did this cost? He felt so comfortable, as if it weren't his. He looked at his old clothes in his hands and thought, these weren't his either. He walked forward down the hallway, thinking that he couldn't get used to this. He tried so hard to get into the Bayazid family, but he still didn't feel like a part of it. It was like gaining weight, the flesh clings to the soul. Hearing the noise from the street, he stopped and went to the window. Outside, a few people were gathered on the training ground. Sobanin beat poor Portly and, calling him a pig, asked if he had forgotten this feeling. Is he having fun because they let him live quietly? He clenched his teeth in rage and hit the lying Portly again, asking if he likes his new friend. He started kicking him and exclaimed, dirty idiots always flock together, right? Watching from the window as he was being meanly beaten, Vlad thought that people are the same everywhere. There are those who live well and have a good time, and those who just can't live in peace. In the end, they are just idiots who prey on those weaker than them. He threw his old clothes over his shoulder and walked further down the corridor, saying that he would probably wear these today. Soon night fell. The protagonist approached Portly's room and knocked on the door. A frightened voice came from the room, asking who it was. Vlad called out to let him know it was him, and his new acquaintance opened the door and asked him his name. He frowned when he saw Portly's appearance, but didn't say a word. Portly, whose face was covered in cuts and bruises, smiled slightly and asked him what he was doing here so late. Vlad replied that he needed something from him, and he was surprised. He then pointed his finger behind him and asked him to give it to him. Portly turned around and, looking at the pork leg hanging from the ceiling, asked if he wanted free jamon, but he really appreciated it. The protagonist confirmed his words, and he lowered his head in disappointment, thinking that even though they weren't friends, he hoped that they would at least smile at each other in a friendly manner when they met. He looked up at his indifferent face and thought that it seemed like he, too, thought that he could only drink blood from him, but it was still better than being alone. With these thoughts, he sadly handed him the jamun, and he, taking it, told him not to be upset about it. He was just taking a fair price. Portly was slightly surprised and did not understand what he meant, and the protagonist's face became gloomy, and he said that a familiar knight once told him something similar. A knight only takes what is rightfully his. After he took the payment, he went to avenge his new acquaintance. Standing in front of a large group of people led by Sobanin, he said that 14 against 1, even in the slums it did not come to this. Sobanin furiously pointed his finger at him and told him to shut up. They will see how long he lasts. The protagonist beckoned the guys to him with his finger and told them to quickly come. He came all this way for them. Shouldn't they do the same? Hearing this, Sobanin gritted his teeth in rage, and then rushed forward, telling the others to attack him. Vlad's face darkened, and he smirked, saying that he was glad he had changed his clothes. After that, he picked up his sword and headed towards them, saying that blood would be shed tonight. After that, the fight began. The guys who were the first to approach Vlad were the first to become exhausted from his blows. The last of them also received a blow, from which he began to lose his balance, but Vlad quickly dealt him another blow, and Sobanin told the others not to retreat. He would not defeat them. Let them block him from the side and surround him. He cursed and thought that when they fought, he was different. What is the point of something like that? 2 months ago, he could barely hold a sword. He ordered his guys not to retreat. Let them remember that he will kill anyone who retreats. A second later, Vlad suddenly jumped up to him and swung his sword. He looked at him menacingly and asked, "He dares to say so, but has he ever actually killed anyone?" His opponent raised his sword and, calling him an idiot, exclaimed, "What did he just bark?" After that, he swung his sword down, but the protagonist deftly ducked and got closer to him, but that is thinking that during the expedition, he was busy delivering single blows with all his might. He struck, but his opponent blocked, and the nameless one agreed, saying that the results of training with Jaeger were showing. He drives his opponents into a prepared trap. After several precise blows, his opponent was exhausted, and when he once again wanted to call him an idiot, he missed a blow to the shoulder and was surprised. Vlad swung his weapon again, thinking that he seemed to understand now. His gap, his space, his own flow. Crouching sharply, he swung his sword to the side and hit his opponent under the knee, from which he immediately lost his balance and fell on his back. Because of the sudden pain in his leg, he began to cry and gritted his teeth, and the next moment he saw Vlad bend over him and raise his sword. He froze in horror, and tears streamed down his cheeks. Gritting his teeth, Vlad abruptly lowered the sword point down, and immediately after that, a loud, frightened cry from Sobanin was heard. All his friends immediately froze in place and looked at him in shock. His whole body shook with fear. It was a wonder he didn't wet himself. He sighed heavily and looked up at Vlad to see his sword stuck in the ground right next to his head. He looked at him menacingly and told him to never look him in the eye again. And let him not mess with the chubby guy. Sobanin was too scared to even utter a word. He just nodded briefly, and looking at his merciless eyes, he realized that he was seriously trying to kill him. After that, the main character stood up and sighed, saying that he had worked off his hemon. He turned to the rest of the guys and asked who was next. Let them finish what they started. They became nervous and froze in place, not daring to move from fear, and he took a few steps towards them and said that if they didn't come, he would. As he approached, the poor boys began to tremble with fear, and despite the threat he posed, they still could not move. After this, there were loud cries and bloodshed. The Count, who had been watching the bloodshed from the window, smiled slightly and said that it was magnificent. Soon, the monthly meeting of the knights arrived, and all the knights and the Count gathered in the throne room. Although it was not intentional, on one side stood those who supported Rudiger. On the opposite side were those who were on Joseph's side, as well as those who remained neutral. The captain of the knights, Anatolis, unrolled a scroll in his hands and said that they had changed the duty schedule to prepare for the absence of Rudiger and the knights who would soon be leaving on a mission. The next thing on the agenda was the distribution of the sacred objects sent by the church. The Count, who was sitting on the throne, turned his gaze towards the Rudiger knights, and seeing their faces tense with anger, thought that the atmosphere had changed dramatically.